Previously we have implemented the behavior so that when we click on the hour labels, our page is scrolled to a particular hour. But this scrolling happens instantly, so what we're gonna do in this lesson is to make this scrolling smooth. First of all, let's open up component where this hour label is located. It is timelineItem component. Let's find this timeline hour component. This is that component by clicking on which the page gets scrolled to a particular hour element. And as we can see here, we have a click event listener registered on this component. And when the click event occurs, we're gonna fire custom event with the name scroll to hour to parent component. And as a payload, we're sending our value which we're fetching from timelineItem object. And of course, in the parent component, we handle this custom event by using function scroll to hour. So in here, to make the scrolling behavior smooth, we're gonna create configuration object with one option called behavior. And the value that we need to make the scrolling behavior smooth is called exactly that, smooth. And now all we have to do to make our scrolling behavior smooth is to pass this options object within scroll into view method, like so. We are doing it in both places. And now every time when we're gonna click on our labels, we can see that our page scrolls to a particular hour smoothly. But this hour change has also caused a negative effect, because when we try to fully refresh the page, we will see that the smooth scrolling behavior applies in this case as well. But what we need instead is that on initial page load, page gets scrolled to current timeline item instantly. So to do this, we have to make this function scroll to hour accept one more parameter, which is gonna be responsible for scrolling behavior. Let's call this parameter isSmooth with a default value of true. And then by using this parameter, we're going to decide which scrolling behavior to use by using ternary expression. So let's write down here this expression and check variable isSmooth. If it is true, we're gonna use smooth scrolling behavior. Otherwise, we're gonna fall back to instant. And now when this function gets called after we click on our label, because it is currently registered as an event listener for scroll to hour event that comes from timelineItem component, the second parameter isSmooth will be true by default, and in this case it's fine, because page in this case should scroll smoothly when we click on our labels. But on initial page load, execution flow goes differently. And when we load the page, this closure which we're passing to watch post effect function gets run, and the page is scrolled to a current timeline item by using this function called scroll to hour. And since on initial page load we don't want smooth scrolling behavior, so let's pass false as a second parameter to this function like this. And then this value gets passed into isSmooth parameter, which will eventually turn this whole ternary expression and produce value instant, which will of course make scrolling behavior on the initial page load instant. And let's check it out. Firstly, I'm gonna try to click on our labels. Let's make sure that in this case, scrolling happens smoothly. Everything works as expected. And now if we try to fully refresh the page, we will see that page gets scrolled to the current timeline item instantly. That's what we wanted. And even after navigating to a timeline page from another page, the page still scrolls instantly to current timeline item. And this is desired behavior, so let's now go back to the editor and do a little refactoring. Let's just simplify this function call scroll to hour. As a first parameter, we're going to pass null in this case. And then let's move the logic, which determines current hour within scroll to hour function, and use optional assignment operator like so. That means if our parameter wasn't passed, we're gonna assign value of current hour to this hour parameter. Otherwise, this assignment will be ignored and the hour parameter will contain passed value from outside into this function. So let's also make this parameter hour optional by assigning null value in here. And let's make sure that in a browser everything still works as expected. Let's try to navigate to a timeline page from another page and make sure that the page gets scrolled to a current timeline item instantly. Everything's working as expected. So let's go on and implement such behavior so that when clicking on logo, we're also going to be scrolled to a current timeline item. Firstly, let's see what is currently going on when we click on the logo. Let's go inside of the header component where our logo component is located. And here we see that we have a click event listener which fires another custom event with the name navigate to parent component. And as a payload with this event, we're sending the name of the page we'd like to navigate to. And of course, within the root component app.view, we have a listener which listens for navigate event and calls goTo function, as we can see in here. And all this goTo function does is it basically modifies value of the reactive variable current page. So now we're gonna have to handle one more case in here and write an if statement. Let's check if the value of the current page equals to timeline, and at the same time, parameter page also equals to the page timeline. That means that we are already at the timeline page, and we clicked on the logo being on the timeline page. In this case, we're gonna have to somehow scroll the page to the current timeline item. But the thing is that that function, which allows us to scroll to the current timeline page, is located within the timeline component right here. It is that function scrollToHour. So we need to somehow gain access to this function to be able to call it from within app component. And let's do just that. Let's go ahead and add a ref to the timeline component within app component. Let's call this ref simply timeline. And this way we can get a reference to the instance of the timeline component in app component. Now we have to also declare the ref with the same name timeline within the app component. Let's do just that. Let's create new constant with the name timeline and use ref function as initializer. And before doing anything else, let's scroll down to our goTo function, and within this if conditional, let's just print out value of our timeline ref, like this, just to see what we're gonna get within this ref. And now in the browser, once I'm going to click on the logo in a console, we should get an output. And this output is the result of printing that timeline ref. So this ref is basically a pointer to the instance of the timeline component. And we know that the timeline component contains the function which we need to call from the app component. It is scrollToHour function. But by default this function is private, so we need to somehow expose this function, so we'll be able to call it from within app component. And to expose some variables or functions to parent component, there is a macro called defineExpose. Let's use this macro right below the defineEmits macro in here. And as a parameter, we should specify which functions and variables we are exposing to the outside. So in this case, we need to expose only one function with the name scrollToHour. So as an object, let's use the object key that corresponds to the function name scrollToHour. So now that we have provided access to this private function scrollToHour, we can easily use reference timeline and call that scrollToHour function from the parent component like this. And by the way, while calling this function scrollToHour in here, we don't need to pass any extra parameters, because those values that are used as default values for these parameters are exactly that we need in this case. So we're not passing any particular hour because we'd like to scroll the page to the current hour by clicking on the logo, and by passing null within this function, current hour will be automatically determined and assigned to our parameter. And as for the second parameter, scrolling behavior when clicking on the logo should be smooth, so the second parameter's default value is also going to work for us. So let's just see if this behavior works. I'm going to click on the logo, and this time we should get smooth scrolling behavior to the current timeline item. That's exactly what we're seeing. So the page smoothly scrolls to the current timeline item, which in my case is 1 PM. And the final improvement we're going to do is we're gonna implement automatic scrolling behavior to the very top of the page. So for example, if we're leaving some page and the scroll bar is at the very end of this page, and then if we're coming back to this page, we're supposed to get scroll bar at the very top. But as we can see currently, it remains at the very bottom. So it's pretty easy to do. Let's go back to the app component and add one more conditional in here. We're going to check here if the page name we're currently trying to navigate to does not equal to timeline. Pretty much that means if the page name will be activity or progress. In this case, we're always going to scroll the page to the very top. And we're doing this by using scrollIntoView method on the body object, like this. So let's see, currently I'm being on the activities page, and the scroll bar is at the very bottom. And once I'm gonna try to go to another page and then come back to activities page, this time I see that scroll bar appears at the very top of the page, which means our scrolling behavior works. So what we have right now regarding scrolling is that when clicking on the logo, we're automatically scrolling the page to the current timeline item, and the scrolling behavior in this case is smooth. And also when we're clicking on a particular hour labels, page scrolls to that hour also smoothly, as well as on initial page load, page gets scrolled to the current timeline item, but in this case, scrolling behavior is instant. Let's continue development of our project in the next lesson. As for now in our project, we have a way to specify amount of time we like to spend on a particular activity by using this select box. And after we're going to measure the time we have already spent on this activity, the remaining time we have to spend on this activity will be decreasing, and would be good to display this remaining time next to this select box, somewhere in here. Because once we set the time we need to spend on a particular activity, and later we're gonna start measuring this time by starting this stopwatch, the remaining time will be slowly decreasing. And this decrease in time we're going to display within ActivityItem component. So for now, let's just do a very basic thing. I'm gonna switch over to ActivityItem component, and right below the base select component, let's create a div and put arbitrary number in here. As we can see, this number appears. So now we're gonna position this number so that select box and this number will be on the same line. But firstly, let's apply some styles to the div which wraps this number. We're gonna make this div flexible container, where elements will be vertically aligned in a center, corners will be rounded, background color will be purple. We're gonna make horizontal paddings 2 units. Let's make font monospaced, font size will be extra large, and the text color will be purple. Let's say 600. So this is what our number looks like right now. And now let's add a few classes to the wrapper, which wraps select box as well as our new number. To place both this element on the same line, we're also gonna make this wrapper flexible container, and the distance between child elements will be 2 units. And now just to move our new number to the right edge of the screen, we're gonna make select box occupy all available space within the flexible container. And it's a matter of assigning only one class called grow to the base select component. And now we got this number exactly where we need this to be. But what we need to display here instead is the value which is stored within seconds-to-complete property of activity object. And of course, once we're gonna reset value in this select box, seconds-to-complete property gets value 0, and once it's 0, we're gonna completely hide our new element, which shows remaining time. So let's do just that. We're gonna use if directive on this div, and as a condition, we're basically going to check if seconds-to-complete property contains value other than 0. In this case, we're gonna show this number, otherwise it will be hidden. So initially there is no number to the right, as we can see, but after we select some value in this select box, that number appears. And of course, after resetting the value in this select box, the number disappears again. So let's just use this property seconds-to-complete to show this number within this div. We're going to interpolate the value of seconds-to-complete property in here. But we don't want to display seconds in a raw format. Thankfully, we already have a function which can format value of seconds for us. It is called format seconds. So let's use this function in here. Let's scroll to the very top and write down an import for format seconds function. We're importing this function from functions module. And as we can see, now this time shows in a proper format. And now that we got our new element exactly at the position where we need this to be, it's time to extract this whole markup into its own component. We're going to call this component ActivitySecondsToComplete. And as we always do, we're gonna create this component within components folder with the name ActivitySecondsToComplete. Here we'll create an empty template tag and paste that markup. And now we need to move this if directive and place it directly on the ActivitySecondsToComplete component. where we use it. Since now we're gonna conditionally render this component, and therefore that function format seconds should also be moved within ActivitySecondsToComplete component. Let's create an empty script tag in here and paste that import of format seconds function. And just because within the template of this component we are referencing activity object, we need to accept this object from outside. So let's use defineProps macro and say that we're gonna accept one prop with the name activity. This prop will be required to pass. The type of this prop will be an object, and the validation function will be isActivityValid. Of course, this function to be used within this component firstly needs to be imported from validators module. Let's write this import in here. And then let's go back to ActivityItem component and pass this new prop with the name activity. And finally, before checking this out in the browser, we need to import this new component within ActivityItem component. In here, let's write down an import for ActivitySecondsToComplete component. So let's take a look in the browser. Currently, ActivityItem component does not contain ActivitySecondsToComplete component, but once after I choose the value by using this select box, that VIF directive will be reevaluated, which will cause ActivitySecondsToComplete component to appear. And after resetting the value, component disappears again. And by now, from visuals perspective, our new component looks pretty good. But of course, we haven't done with it yet, because we haven't really written any logic to make this component display remaining time dynamically, while we're gonna measure the time by using our stopwatch. So in the next lesson, we're gonna continue working on this component. Let's continue, and now that we have a component which shows remaining time for a particular activity, this time is not automatically updated whenever we select new time by using this select box. And also whenever we're gonna track the time for this activity on the timeline page, we're supposed to sum up all these tracked times and then subtract this total time from the remaining time, just to calculate how much time we still need to spend to fully complete particular activity. And just to make our testing easier, we're going to change a little bit the logic, which generates timelineItem objects. And for now, we're going to generate random activities only for the first 5 objects from this array. So let's start. Inside of the functions.js, let's find that function which generates timelineItem objects. It is this generateTimelineItems function. And here we're going to comment out these 2 lines and actually change the logic which derive random values for activity ID and activity seconds properties. And in order to generate random activities only for the first 5 timelineItem objects, let's write the following expression here. I'm going to create an array with 5 elements, and then let's check if the value stored within parameter hour is included within this array. We're going to select random activity from the activities array. For example, let's get a remainder of the division of the parameter hour by 3, and then extract an identifier of this activity. And in all other cases, we're not going to assign any activity, so let's use null. And for the activity seconds property, the condition will be pretty much the same. Here we're also going to check if our parameter is included within this array. And if so, let's just multiply this hour parameter by 600 to get more or less appropriate value which characterizes amount of seconds. And if activity for this particular hour was not chosen, we're gonna use 0 seconds. And that's it. Now if we take a look at the timeline page, we're gonna see that actually only first 5 timeline items from this list have random activities assigned, as well as random time. And now having all this test data in place, let's go back to ActivitySecondsToComplete component and figure out how we're going to calculate amount of remaining seconds for a particular activity. So first of all, I'm going to create new constant, seconds, and the way we're going to calculate amount of seconds will be as follows. Firstly, let's call the function getTotalActivitySeconds, which does not exist yet. So this function is supposed to return sum of the tracked seconds for the particular activity. And then by subtracting values stored within seconds-to-complete property of the activity object, we can get remaining time we still have to spend to fully finish this activity. And since we're using props object in here, we need to assign all the props to props constant, like this. So in order to calculate the sum of the tracked seconds for a particular activity, this function getTotalActivitySeconds needs to know which activity exactly it should calculate amount of seconds for, as well as it needs to know where to get those seconds we need to sum up. And all those seconds are stored within the objects inside of timelineItems array. So we're going to pass two parameters to this function. First one will be an activity object, and the second one will be timelineItems array. And of course, none of this data is available in this component yet, so we need to accept it from outside. So let's copy the declaration of timelineItems prop and paste it within our ActivitySecondsToComplete component. And at the top, let's import missing validation function, validate timelineItems. And then once the difference of seconds will be calculated and stored within seconds constant, before actually storing amount of seconds, we have to apply formatting, which we can do by using formatSeconds function. So let's wrap this expression into function called formatSeconds. And now we need to find a way how to pass timelineItems array within this object, since this is not available yet here. So let's go to the parent component ActivityItem and pass timelineItems array as a prop with the name timelineItems, like this. But the problem is that this timelineItems array is not even available in this parent component, so we need to pass timelineItems array from the ancestor component. Once again, let's copy over declaration of timelineItems prop from the timeline component and paste it into ActivityItem component. So we're gonna have to pass timelineItem prop from outside. And again, in this file, let's scroll up and import validation function, validate timelineItems. And now let's go up in the tree of components, open up parent component, which in this case is the activities component, and to every ActivityItem component, we're going to pass timelineItems array as another prop. So let's add this prop in here. And by the way, even in this component, this timelineItems array is not available. So we need to use the same technique and add declaration of timelineItems prop within this component, as well as add import for validate timelineItems function. And finally, the parent component for this TheActivities component is actually our root component, where we actually see this timelineItems array is defined. So right now, all we need to do is to pass this array to the activities component. Let's copy this prop from the timeline component and paste it in here. And of course, this is not the best way of passing properties through many different components that don't even use this component, but still have to accept this property to pass it further down the chain to the component, which actually needs this property. In the upcoming lessons, we're gonna see a better approach to do this, but for now, let's continue. And now, since we have passed timelineItems array from the parent component to the activities component, eventually this array is going to end up within our ActivitySecondsToComplete component within timelineItems prop that we're passing as a second parameter in here to get totalActivitySeconds function to calculate sum of the tracked seconds for a particular activity. So next, what we're gonna do is to actually define this function getTotalActivitySeconds. Let's switch over to functions.js and write about generate timelineItems function. We're going to create new function with the name getTotalActivitySeconds, which is going to accept two parameters, activity object and timelineItems array. And for now, let's just return 0 in here. And eventually our difference of seconds will be calculated, and this way we're gonna find out how much time we still need to spend on a particular activity to fully complete it. So actually, before writing implementation for getTotalActivitySeconds function, let's import it at the top from the functions module. And let's talk about how it is supposed to work. So for example, I would like to spend on the activity coding 30 minutes. I choose this option in here. We see that the remaining time of 30 minutes appears to the right. That's our goal that we have set for this activity. And now let's go to the timeline page and see where this activity is chosen for which timeline items. As we can see, this activity is chosen for the first hour, but in this case, tracked time is 0. So that means that we haven't spent any time within this hour for that particular activity coding. And if we scroll down a little bit, we will see that there is one more timeline item where that activity is chosen. And this time we have tracked 30 minutes for the coding activity. So that means that we have achieved our goal for this coding activity. And if we subtract this amount of time that we have specified for the coding activity from the time that we have already tracked for this activity, we're supposed to get a difference which is 0. So the 0 should be displayed right here. And as we can see right now, it doesn't work as expected. So let's start implementing getTotalActivitySeconds function. And just to calculate amount of tracked time for a particular activity, first of all, we're gonna go over timelineItem objects and filter this array by specific activity that we try to calculate amount of seconds for. So we're gonna write a simple condition and check if current timelineItem was assigned the activity we're looking for. And this activity is passed as a first parameter into this function. So we're basically comparing IDs of these activities. And this way, at the end, it's going to produce new array, which consists only of those timeline items that were assigned activity that we need. And then on this new array, we're going to use another native method called reduce. This method accepts closure, which in turn receives two parameters. First parameter is going to contain final value we're going to calculate. In our case, it will be total amount of seconds tracked for the particular activity. And the second parameter will be timelineItem object. And since this closure will be called for every timelineItem object, from the filtered array we're going to receive every timelineItem object within this parameter. And as a second argument, reduce accepts initial value, which will be assigned to the first parameter total seconds. And we start our calculation from 0 seconds, so let's specify 0 as a second parameter. And here to calculate total amount of seconds for a particular activity, we're gonna have to add value stored within ActivitySeconds property of every timelineItem object to the total amount of seconds calculated by now, which is stored within total seconds parameter. And the value which will be returned from this closure is going to be assigned to total seconds parameter in the following call of this closure for the next timelineItem object. And at the same time here, we also round the resulting value. So let's take a look at our timeline page and see how much time was initially tracked for the coding activity. As we can see, coding activity is assigned to the first timelineItem, but in this case, the value of tracked seconds is 0. And as for the fourth timelineItem, we can see that tracked time in this case is 30 minutes. And this value of time is of course taken from ActivitySeconds property of the particular timelineItem object. But originally, this time is represented by seconds. And eventually, after running all these instructions, at the end, we're gonna get total amount of seconds tracked for a particular activity, because we went through all the timeline items and summed up values of ActivitySeconds properties of every timelineItem object, but only those timelineItem objects that were assigned a particular activity that we are trying to calculate amount of seconds for. And then from this total tracked time, we're going to subtract our initial goal that we have set for this activity. And that initial time is stored within SecondsToComplete property of activity object. And at the end, this calculated difference will be displayed in this component. So initially we have tracked 30 minutes for the coding activity, and our goal is also 30 minutes. So we see that the difference of seconds in this case will be 0, which is displayed in our ActivitySecondsToComplete component, because we have subtracted the time that we have chosen for this activity, which is 30 minutes, from the time that we have tracked, which is also 30 minutes. So in this case we consider this activity as finished, because we have achieved our goal. But for now this functionality has a lot of flaws yet, because if we decide to change our goal by selecting different value, our component which shows remaining time is not going to be updated. And even if we will start tracking time for the coding activity, in this case also, that ActivitySecondsToComplete component will show initial time. But in this case, since our stopwatch is currently running, this time displayed in here should decrease every second. So we are going to work on this functionality in the upcoming lessons. In this lesson we're going to make our remaining time change dynamically, so that whenever we update the time by using this select box for a particular activity, remaining time will also be updated. And the reason why it's not updated right now is that within ActivitySecondsToComplete component, we calculate remaining time and assign to the seconds constant only once, when this component gets instantiated. But as we can see, this whole expression depends on a couple of other variables, such as activity object and timelineItems array. And to make some expressions to be recalculated dynamically, we can wrap this whole expression within the closure, and this closure will pass into a computed function, like so. And this way, whenever one of the reactive dependencies will change within this closure, this whole closure will be executed again, and our seconds constant will receive a new value, since it is now a computed property. And actually, let's also move this formatSeconds function call to the template like this. So before checking it out in the browser, let's go up and import computed function from the Vue package. And in the browser, let's try to change remaining time for a particular activity. And now, as we can see, component which displays this remaining time always updates, depending on which option we're going to select by using this select box. But still, this remaining time shows in a little bit confusing form. Because what if, for example, we have already measured more time for this activity than we have chosen by using this select box? In this case, remaining time should be displayed with a plus sign, because we have actually tracked more time than required based on our set goal. But if actually we have tracked less time than required, then this remaining time will be displayed with a minus sign. And to change the sign dynamically, let's create one more computed property within ActivitySecondsToComplete component. I'm going to create new constant called sign. Here let's use computed function and specify the following expression within the closure of this computed function. I have also renamed seconds variable on seconds diff to make it clear that this seconds diff variable stores time difference. And here let's use a ternary expression and check the value of this seconds diff variable, and if this value will be greater or equal to 0, we're going to use plus sign, otherwise minus. And up here we're going to create one more computed property called seconds, and within this closure in here, we're going to use our other computed properties. Firstly, sign, and since this is a computed property, we have to reference it by using value property. And after this, let's use another computed property seconds diff to display time difference. And actually in here we're also going to format this time difference by using formatSeconds function. So let's move this call from the template into computed property called seconds and call it in here. And now let's see if we're going to select more time than was already tracked for this particular activity, then the remaining time will be displayed with a minus sign in front. And if I'm going to choose the time which is equal to the time that was already tracked, in this case the difference will be 0, as we can see right here. And in this case the plus sign will be displayed. And now let's go ahead and depending on this sign, let's use different colors to show remaining time. We can do it in the following way. Let's create another computed property called color classes. And based on the ternary expression, we're going to check the value of the seconds diff computed property, and if this value will be less than 0, that means we still have to spend some time on this activity to fully complete it. So in this case, we're gonna use the following classes to make this component red. Let's make background color red with a tint 100, and the text color will be red with a tint 600. Otherwise, we have already tracked more time than we've initially specified. So in this case, we're gonna use green tints. Background color will be green with a tint 100, and the text color will be also green with a tint 600. And now what's left to do is actually assign this color class's computed property as an attribute class to the root element of this component, like so, in order for those color classes to be actually applied. And now let's check it out in the browser. And here we go. Whenever we still have some time to track to finish particular activity, this block is shown by using red colors. And whenever we have already tracked more time than needed, the remaining time block is colored with a green color. And now let's go back to the editor and do a little refactoring. For example, in here we're applying two attributes with the same name, class attributes. So right now let's do a little refactoring, and in here, instead of applying two attributes with exactly same name, we're going to use one attribute. let's just create computed property which is going to hold all necessary classes which we're going to apply. So in here, let's create constant classes, and then let's copy over all the classes that are currently applied to the root element of this component. We're going to paste all of those classes in here, and at the end, depending on the state of this remaining time component, we're going to use another computed property color classes. And then instead of using 2 attributes class for this element, we're going to use only one. And as a value, we're going to use our new computed property called classes like this. And after this, we're gonna get exactly same results from the visual perspectives. And our classes are changed dynamically based on the selected value, since these classes are computed properties that actually depend on the selected time. So let's continue working on our project in the next lesson. In this lesson, we're actually going to dynamically update the time that is displayed by using ActivitySecondsToComplete component after we select value by using this select box. And we're going to update this time every second once we start tracking the time for this particular activity by using this stopwatch. So for example, if I have started the timer for a coding activity, and as we can see, it increases every second, so that remaining time in this component should be decreasing every second as well. So first of all, let's recall how our stopwatch component works. And the component which is responsible for a stopwatch is called timelineStopwatch. So right here, when we click on the start button, this start function gets executed, and within this function, we set up the timer, which is supposed to run every second. So our reactive variable seconds, which shows time of the stopwatch, will be updated every second, which means that every second we should also notify a parent component to update the time for a particular activity, and we're going to do this by firing custom event with the name updateSeconds, like this. And every time this event gets fired, along with this event, we're also going to send 1 second. So before going any further, let's register this event by using defineEmits macro. The event name will be updateSeconds, and validation function will be isNumber, which, by the way, is already imported within this component. So we can continue. So now let's talk about how we can notify a root component about the time change from timelineStopwatch component. In order to do so, timelineStopwatch component should fire an event to timelineItem component. The timelineItem component should fire a custom event to the timeline component. And finally, the timeline component will fire a custom event directly to app component. As we can see, there are a lot of things we have to do in order to notify parent component about some action which has happened in one of the child components, which is actually deeply nested within components tree. But later we're gonna learn about more appropriate technique in this case, and for now, let's do this. Let's start firing custom events all the way to the root component. And once root component receives appropriate event from timelineStopwatch component, it is going to update ActivitySeconds property of the timelineItem object with the new time. Since when our stopwatch is running, this time will be updated every second. So therefore, custom event will be fired to root component every second. And then the component which displays the remaining time, ActivitySecondsToComplete component, can actually read the updated value of ActivitySeconds property of timelineItem object and show updated time. So this all is going to happen automatically because our seconds div computed property depends on timelineItems array. And that means whenever one of the properties of objects stored within the timelineItems array gets changed, this computed property will be recalculated, and therefore updated time will be shown by this component. So let's go ahead and start firing events. Everything starts from timelineStopwatch component. We have already registered updateSeconds event in this component, which by the way gets fired to parent component every second. And the next step would be to listen for this event from timelineItem component. So let's register event directive with the name of event updateSeconds on this component. And once this component receives this event, we're going to fire another custom event. Let's call this event updateActivitySeconds. And as part of this event, we're going to send amount of seconds as well that we have just received from timelineStopwatch component. And this amount of seconds is stored within a special event variable $event. And we're passing this value with this event up the chain to the parent component. And before registering the listener for this event in the parent component, let's declare updateActivitySecondsEvent within this defineEmits macro, and its validation function we'll use is number, because amount of seconds that gets sent along with this event should actually be a number. And that's what we are verifying by using this isNumber validation function. So let's import this isNumber function from validators module, switch over to parent component, which in this case is the timeline component. And on timelineItem component, let's start listening for updateActivitySecondsEvent, like this. And once this event is received, we're going to send another custom event to the root component called updateTimelineItemActivity to make it more clear what should happen when your root component receives this event. And the root component should know which exactly timelineItem object we're going to update the time for, as well as amount of seconds by which we should update this time. So we're going to pass two pieces of data. First one will be an actual timelineItem object, which is stored within timelineItem variable in here. And the second parameter will be amount of seconds that we just received, along with updateActivitySecondsEvent. So let's quickly write validation function for this new event, updateTimelineItemActivity within defineEmits macro. It is going to receive two pieces of data. First one will be timelineItem object, and the second will be amount of seconds. Let's call this ActivitySeconds. So let's validate this data separately. Firstly, we're gonna call isTimelineItemValid function to validate timelineItem object. And to verify that both of these validation functions will return true, we're going to wrap both of these functions within an array and call every method on this array. And this way we're going to verify that every value within this array will be true. So let's import missing validation function isNumber within this file. Then let's go to the app component. And finally, let's listen for that event, updateTimelineItemActivity on the timeline component. And let's call custom function with the same name, updateTimelineItemActivity as a handler for this event. The function will be actually pretty simple. Let's start defining this function. UpdateTimelineItemActivity. It is going to receive two parameters. One of them will be timelineItem object, and the second one will be amount of seconds. And all we have to do within this function is to actually update property ActivitySeconds of the received timelineItem object by adding amount of seconds that was received within the second parameter. So let's use shorthand for an addition and assignment at the same time, like this, by adding value of ActivitySeconds variable to ActivitySeconds property. And finally, let's go to the browser. Here we're gonna choose some time for the coding activity, let's say 1 hour, and then on the timeline page, we're gonna start the timer for this coding activity, going back to activities page, and let's verify that the remaining time will be updated every second, which is exactly what we're seeing. The time is decreasing. And if we're gonna choose less time that was already tracked by now, this block will be green, and this time will be increasing. But there is actually one more case when we need to fire a custom event from timeline stopwatch component to the root component to notify root component about time change. So if in here we fire this custom event every second when our stopwatch is running, we're also going to fire the same event when we reset the time of the stopwatch. And to reset the time, we call reset function. For example, I'll choose any option in here. We have set our goal for this coding activity, and then if I start tracking time for this activity and reset the time after, then we will see that the actual time that ActivitySecondsToComplete component shows was not reset, but in fact it should reset back to 15 minutes. So let's think how we can fix it. As was said before, we also have to fire custom event update seconds, so let's copy this line and paste it within reset function. But this time we're going to update the time of timelineItem object not by 1 second, but by the time which is stored within reactive variable seconds. And this variable stores current time of this stopwatch. So once we reset this time, we should subtract this time from timelineItem object. So we're gonna have to pass negative value in this case. And here's how it is going to work. So for this particular stopwatch, we can see that it shows 7 seconds, and this value is stored within the seconds reactive variable within this component. And our ActivitySecondsToComplete component shows this time as remaining for the coding activity. And after resetting this time, we should actually subtract 7 seconds from this number, which is why we're actually passing 7 seconds with minus sign in front in here. So eventually this number will end up within ActivitySeconds parameter of this function within the root component. And when we're gonna add negative value to the ActivitySeconds property, it is actually going to subtract this amount of seconds, which is exactly what we need. So let's check this out in the browser. Let's specify that we would like to spend on the coding activity 1 hour. And once we start measuring the time for this activity, we will see that the time is decreasing in here. And after we're going to reset this time, then on the activities page, we can see that that tracked time was subtracted, and we got here initial value. Let's continue development in the next lesson. In order to show remaining time within ActivitySecondsToComplete component, this remaining time should be passed as a part of activity object, as a prop inside of ActivitySecondsToComplete component. And all activities objects are stored within activities array inside of app component. And by the way, whenever we're gonna start tracking the time for this activity by using this stopwatch, every second we're gonna fire a custom event all the way up to the root component, so it can update tracked time for a particular activity. And now let's check it out how this works in terms of code. Let's open up timeline stopwatch component, and inside of a start function, this function is executed whenever we start our stopwatch. We're gonna fire a custom event update seconds every second. So inside of the parent component, which is timelineItem component, we listen for this event update seconds and fire another event update activity seconds to the parent component. And along with this event, we pass the amount of seconds we just received from timeline stopwatch component. So as it usually goes, inside of the timeline component, we have a listener for update activity seconds component, which in turn will fire another custom event update timelineItem activity seconds to the root component so it can update remaining time. But in order to know for which timelineItem object we should update ActivitySeconds property, we should include this object as part of this event. So as a second parameter in here, we're passing timelineItem object for which we need to update ActivitySeconds property. And as a third parameter, we're passing the actual value of seconds. And finally, within the app component, we have registered a listener update timelineItemActivity which is basically going to add value of seconds to ActivitySeconds property of timelineItem object. So as we can see, we had to do a lot of work in order to update this single property ActivitySeconds. We had to fire a custom event from timeline stopwatch component all the way up to the root component. But what if we could just simply provide an access to this function, so this function can be called right from timeline stopwatch component, without having to handle lots of custom events. And there is actually a way to do just that, and it's called provide inject. This is so-called the dependency injection approach that Vue provides us with. And in order to provide access to the function or a variable from some component to all its children components, we can use function called provide. As a first parameter in here, we're specifying the key under which variable or a function will be accessed from the child component. And as a second parameter, we specify a reference to this function or variable that we'd like to provide access to. And since we are providing access to update timelineItemActivity function, we're specifying the reference to this function as a second argument, and then this provide function should be imported from the Vue package. So let's do that up here. And now we no longer need to listen for some custom events, such as update timelineItemActivity on the timeline component. Let's remove this event registration from here, and then go back to timeline stopwatch component. And here, in order to access that function from the app component that we have just provided access to by using provide function, we need to call here inject function, which should also be imported from the Vue package like this. And all we have to do in this component is basically create new constant with any name. This constant will store the reference to that function from the root component. And by simply calling the function inject with a proper key, we're able to get a reference to the function from the root component. And now, since we need to call this function every second to update the time for the timeline object, we can simply call this function within this set interval closure instead of firing update seconds event every second. And now let's see what kind of arguments we have to provide to this function. So inside of the app component, we can see that this function accepts two arguments. First one is the timelineItem object, and the second one, activity seconds. So firstly, we need to get access to timelineItem object inside of timelineStopwatch component, and we can do so by passing prop with the name timelineItem from timelineItem component into timelineStopwatch, like so. And now we no longer need to pass these two extra properties, seconds and hour, because this data is contained within timelineItem object. So let's remove these two properties from here, and also remove the import of isNumber function from here. And just because we are no longer sending custom event update activity seconds from the timelineItem component, we can remove this registration from defineEmits macro. After this, let's go to timelineStopwatch component and modify property declarations. So this component no longer accepts props with names hour and seconds. So let's remove this prop declaration. And instead, this component is going to accept only one prop called timelineItem, which will be required. The type of this prop will be an object, and the validation function will be isTimelineItem valid. Let's go up and quickly import this function from validators module and remove the import for isOurValid function. And by the way, isNumber function is no longer used in this component, so let's remove this one as well. And now let's modify the way we access value of seconds and hour by using props object. And since now we pass only one prop called timelineItem, we need to gain access to seconds property by using timelineItem object. In this case, we're gonna use a reference to ActivitySeconds property on this timelineItem object. And by the way, we already have a props object declared in here, so let's scroll a little bit down. And here, when we access our property, we need to do so by using timelineItem prop, like this. And because we are no longer firing custom event update seconds from timelineStopwatch component, we can simply remove defineEmits macro. And now we have all required data in this component to pass to update timelineItemActivity function. So by using props object, we're gonna pass timelineItem object as the first argument to this function, and as a second argument, we're passing amount of seconds, just like before. Let's specify 1 second. So we can safely remove this emit function. Let's scroll down to reset function. In this function, we also fire this custom event. So let's replace this event on update timelineItemActivity function call. But as we can see, as a second argument to this function call, we need to pass value of seconds reactive variable with a negative sign, like so. And since we are directly calling this function from the root component, we don't need to listen for update activity seconds event from the timeline component. Let's remove this event registration from here. And the same goes with this event registration within defineEmits macro. Let's remove this function. And because of that, isNumber function is no longer used. Let's also remove this import. And right now, within Vue Developer Tools, if we take a look at the right side, in here we're gonna see the new section called Provided. And this section lists our new function that was provided from within the root component, update timelineItemActivity, which means all the child components of the root component can easily gain access to this function and call it directly. So right now, if I'm going to start tracking time for the coding activity by using the stopwatch, this component now has access to that update timelineItemActivity function. So it can easily call that function directly to update the time of a particular timelineItem object. And this updated time, of course, will be reflected within ActivitySecondsToComplete component on the activities page. So we have drastically simplified the code of updating activity seconds for a particular activity, because we no longer have to fire custom event every second from timelineStopwatch component all the way back to the app component just to update single property of the timelineItem object. And we were able to do so by providing access to update timelineItemActivity function to all child components of the root component by using provide function call. And if any child component will need to gain access to this function, it can simply call inject with the corresponding key under which that function was registered within a root component. And this is exactly what we're doing within timelineStopwatch component by calling this function directly. And in the upcoming lessons, we're gonna use this provide inject technique a lot to provide access to some data or function from parent components to descendant components. In this lesson, we're going to continue using provide inject technique to provide access to some data or functions to descendant components from parent components. And specifically in this lesson, we're going to provide access to timelineItems array to ActivitySecondsToComplete component, since this component needs to read this array in order to calculate the remaining time. And for now, we're passing this array to ActivitySecondsToComplete component as a prop. But the problem is that timelineItems array is declared within the root component. So all the parent components that come before ActivitySecondsToComplete component, they also need to get access to timelineItems array in order to send this array as props down to ActivitySecondsToComplete component. As we can see in here, ActivityItem component also accepts this array as a prop. The same goes with the activities parent component. And finally, this timelineItems array is passed as a prop from the root component. And now, just to avoid passing this prop through a lot of different components, to pass it to the descendant component, which is actually going to use this array, we can use the technique provide inject to provide access to timelineItems array from the root component to any descendant component, which can get access to this array by simply calling inject function like here. So right now we're going to provide access to timelineItems array declared within the app component. First of all, let's move the provide function call to the end of this script. And then let's duplicate this line, and this time we're gonna provide access to timelineItems array. So let's call this key simply timelineItems. And just because timelineItems array is a reactive array, the underlying value we need to read by using value property like this. And after doing this, we no longer need to explicitly pass timelineItems array to the activities component via prop. Let's remove this line. And of course, since we have removed this prop, we no longer need to declare this prop within define props macro. Let's remove this declaration from the activities component. So this way validation function validate timelineItems, as we can see, is no longer used. So let's remove this import. The same thing goes with ActivityItem component. We no longer need to pass timelineItems array as a prop. So we need to do the same within ActivityItem component. Let's switch over to this component. Firstly, we're going to remove property declaration timelineItems, as well as import of validation function validate timelineItems. And finally, we're no longer passing timelineItems array as a property to ActivitySeconds component, because we can simply gain access to timelineItems array within ActivitySecondsToComplete component by using the inject function. We're gonna do it right now. Firstly, let's remove timelineItems declaration from define props macro, as well as validate timelineItems function. So instead, just to gain access to timelineItems array, we're gonna use inject, which we need to import from Vue package. Right here, let's create new constant timelineItems, and by using function call inject with the appropriate key, which we have used to register timelineItems array from the root component, this key is called timelineItems. We get a reference to timelineItems array within timelineItems constant. And now whenever this timelineItems array is used inside of this component, we don't need to reference this array by using props object. But since this array is available as a simple timelineItems constant, we're gonna reference timelineItems array as a normal constant, like this. And after this, after selecting ActivitySecondsToComplete component within Vue DevTools, on the right side we can see section provided, which now includes one more entry, timelineItems array. Which means we can easily directly access this timelineItems array without having to pass this array as properties from the root component, because the root component now provides access to this array to every descendant component. And now we can do all the things we were able to do before, such as setting the time goal for this particular activity, and then start tracking the time. Let's make sure that this time decreases every second on activities page. And now let's also try to reset the stopwatch time and make sure that the time on the activities page was reset back to its original value. And this is exactly what we're seeing in here. So we have successfully provided access to TimelineItems array from the root component to all its descendants. We're going to continue development in the next lesson, and the link to the repository of this project will be in the video description. In this lesson, we're going to continue using dependency injection technique to continue providing some of the data to descendant components. And in this lesson, we're going to provide activities array to timelineItem component, because currently it is passed from root component all the way down to timelineItem component. So let's switch over to the app component, and here let's use provide function code to provide access to activities array. And since activities array is stored within a reactive variable, we should reference value property to get access to this underlying array. And now there is no need to pass this array as a prop to the timeline component. So let's remove this line. And inside of the timeline component, we can easily remove prop declaration, activities, as well as validation function, deleteActivities. And since this array was previously passed to every timelineItem component as activities prop, now we no longer need to do this. So we can remove this prop from here, and then let's go inside of timelineItem component and remove corresponding prop declaration, as well as import of that validation function deleteActivities. Because since we have provided activities array from the app component to all descendant components, we can use inject function in this component to get access to activities array from the root component. Let's just do it above the setActivity function in here. We're going to create new constant called activities, and by using inject function call, we're gonna get reference to activities array like this. And now wherever we have referenced activities array within this component, we were doing it by using props object. But now since this object is no longer a prop, we're basically going to reference this array as normal constant like this. And after this, if we take a look at the Vue DevTools, in the provided section we can see new entry, our activities array. So we no longer pass this array as a prop within timelineItem component, but still everything works as before. We can select an activity, then start tracking time for this activity, and on the activities page, this remaining time will be decreasing. And after we have provided access to activities array to descendant components, we can do the same thing for another array, activity select options, which is used within timelineItem component. And this array holds options for the activity select box on the timeline page and used to be passed as a prop options within base select component, which is responsible for showing select box. I am talking about this select box right above the stopwatch. So initially, array of options for this select box is declared within the root component by using this computed property. And every time we add or remove activities reactive array will be modified, and hence this computed property will be recalculated, and activity select options constant will get different array of options for the select box. And now we're going to provide access to this activity select options array by using the provide function call, as we have done before with timelineItems and activities arrays. And now we no longer need to pass one more property activity select options into the timeline component. Along with that, we can also remove declaration of activity select options prop inside of the timeline component and import a validation function validate select options. Also, there is activity select options prop which is passed into timelineItem component. We don't need to do this anymore, because we're going to access this array directly by using inject function call within timelineItem component. So there is no need for prop called activity select options in this component, and import of validation function validate select options can also be removed. So now let's go ahead and finally get access to activity select options array directly by using inject function call. We're going to create new constant activity select options, call inject function with appropriate key activity select options. And this way we can simply pass activity select options array as a prop options into base select component. What we're doing in here. So in the Vue developer tools, inside of a provided section, we have a new entry for activity select options array. And we access this array directly within timelineItem component in order to display options for this activity select box. And to do this, we are passing activity select options array from timelineItem component into base select component as a prop with the name options. And our activity select box works as before. Now that we have provided access to activity select options array from the root component directly to timelineItem component, we're going to do the same with another list of options, which is responsible for showing options for another select box on activities page. It is this select box with time periods. Alright, for now let's see where this array of options is coming from into ActivityItem component. And as we can see, this array of options is stored within period select options constant, which we are directly importing within ActivityItem component from our constants module. So inside of this module, we're calling generatePeriodSelectOptions function in order to generate array of options. And also this function gets passed array of minutes. So now we're gonna refactor this part of code a little bit and make it so this array of options for time periods will be available from within root component, and we're going to provide access to this array by using provide function. So we're gonna register this array under period select options key, and as well we're gonna use function called generate period select options in order to get array of time periods. Let's also fix the key. Instead of generate period select options, it should be simply period select options like this. And we also have to import this function generate period select options from the functions module. Let's do so right here. And inside of constants.js, we're gonna change this implementation a bit by moving this array of minutes directly within generatePeriodSelectOptions function. So we're gonna place this array right at the beginning of this function. Let's rename it on period in minutes by using camel case notation. And this function no longer needs first parameter, which we're gonna remove. And now there is actually no need for that period select options constant within the constants.js module. We're going to remove this constant declaration because we are already calling this generate period select options function within app component. Therefore, the import of this function in this file is no longer needed as well. So as a reminder, we're already calling this generate period select options function right here. And at the same time, we provide access to this array of generated period select options to all descendant components. And now actually all we have to do is to get a reference to this array from that component which needs this array of options. And in our case, we need to access this array from ActivityItem component. So in here, we're gonna import Inject function. And right at the end of this script, we're gonna create new constant period select options, which is basically going to hold a reference to period select options array that is declared within the app component. Since we have provided that array by using function provide, we can get the reference on the provided data by inject function. And now within the template, we need to reference correct constant name to pass array of options as an options prop within base select component like so. So let's also scroll up and remove import of unused constant period select options, because previously we have completely removed this constant. And in the Vue DevTools, by selecting ActivityItem component, in the provided section we can see a new entry for period select options array, which is now available directly within ActivityItem component. And by using this array, we generate options for this select box. So everything still works as expected. Let's continue in the next lesson. Let's continue simplifying our code, and in this lesson, we're gonna simplify the process of activity selection for every timelineItem object. And the way it's gonna be done is basically by assigning selected activity ID to activity ID property of the particular timelineItem object. So in terms of code, it looks like this. From within timelineItem component, we have the listener registered for the select event on the base select component. And as a handler for this listener, we use setActivity function, which is basically going to fire a custom event called setActivity to the parent component. And also this event will contain activity object that we have just selected. And from within the parent component, the timeline will listen for the setActivity event and fire another custom event called setTimelineItemActivity to root component. But in this case, we're passing two pieces of data. First one is the timelineItem object, for which we're about to update activity. And as a third argument in here, we're using that activity object that we have received as part of setActivity event from the timelineItem component. And finally, we handle this event inside of the root component by using setTimelineItemActivity function, which is basically going to assign activity ID to the activity ID property of timelineItem object. As we can see, there is nothing special about this function, but the fact that we have to listen for a bunch of custom events just to get a signal from one of the descendant components to update activity for some timelineItem object is quite a lot of work. So to avoid all those event listeners, we can simply provide access to this function by using provide function call, as we were doing before. So we're gonna add one more provide function call. This time we're gonna use setTimelineItemActivity as a key and provide the reference to this function as a second argument, like so. And after this, we can easily get reference to this function by using Inject function call from within timelineItem component, like so. So now we're gonna call this function directly once we receive select event from base select component. And this will happen when new option will be selected. But we also have to provide a couple more parameters to this function. First one will be the timelineItem object, for which we're about to assign new activity. And the second argument will be activity ID, which is stored within special event variable, because that select event, which is received from base select component, includes activity ID as a payload, which we can access in here by using special event variable. So now we're calling this function defined within the app component directly when we select new activity by using the select box. And as a result, we no longer need to register custom event select activity inside of timelineItem component. So let's remove this line within defineEmits macro. Let's also scroll up a little bit and remove import of unused function is activity valid. And this way select activity function becomes unused, as we can see, which is why we can easily remove this function as well, along with another function used inside of this function find activity by ID. So we're gonna remove both of these functions. And after doing all that, we can see that activities array is no longer used as well inside of this component. So let's go ahead and remove this constant activities, then going back to the root component. And from here we can also remove event registration for setTimelineItemActivity event. Because we are assigning particular activity ID to timelineItem object directly within timelineItem component when we receive select event after selecting particular activity, we're calling directly function setTimelineItemActivity, which is defined within the root component. But we were able to get access to this function from timelineItem component by using provide inject technique. And also when we're calling this function, it's really important to provide all necessary arguments, because as a first argument this function expects timelineItem object, and as a second argument it expects activity object that we are about to assign to the timelineItem object. But this time we're not passing the whole activity object, but only activity ID, so let's rename this parameter on activity ID. And now in the browser, let's check it out. We're gonna try to select activity by using the select box and make sure that no errors happen after we do so. So everything seems to be fine. Now let's go back to the editor. And by the way, we even no longer have to use that nullable activity object that we were using before when we were resetting the value of the activity select box. Because this time whenever we reset value of the select box, second parameter activity ID will get value null. And this value we're gonna assign directly to activity ID property of the timelineItem object. And everything will be working fine. So let's go ahead and switch over to the constants module, find that nullable activity constant, and remove this declaration. And now let's just do a little moving around of some constants, specifically those constants responsible for the page names, and move all these constants to the top of this file, like so, for a better grouping of related constants. And at the end of this lesson, let's also remove a couple more event listeners that we no longer need, such as select activity inside of the timeline component. Let's remove this line, and along with that we can easily remove validation function for that event. So we can completely remove usage of defineEmits macro, since there is only one event registered in here, which we no longer fire from this component. And now let's scroll up to the beginning of this file and remove a couple more unused imports. And there is also one more unused import within timelineItem component. That is this nullable activity constant. Since we have already removed this constant before, therefore we don't need this import. So one more time, let's make sure that when we select activity by using this select box, we don't get any errors. And also when we reset the value. So everything seems to be working fine. And finally, let's go inside of app component. And right here, when we were providing access to activities array, since we no longer have to receive access to this array from any descendant components, we don't need to provide it in here. So we can easily remove this line. And at this, we're gonna finish this lesson. On the activities page, there is one more action that we are doing, which is by using this select box, we have a way to select amount of time to spend on this particular activity. And once we select this time, we'll let the root component know that we have to update time for this activity, since all data mutations happen in our root component. So just like in the previous lesson, we're going to provide access to that function which is responsible for setting new time for a particular activity. So that function can be called directly from within ActivityItem component whenever we select a new time. And for now, what actually happens inside of the root component when we select the new time is basically going to assign new value to seconds-to-complete property of the particular activity object. And this new value is actually the value which was just selected. And then this whole activities array gets passed to the activities component as activities prop. And individual activity objects from this array will get passed to ActivityItem components as a prop activity. And of course, one of the activities prop is seconds-to-complete, which is used to show pre-selected value for this select box. So let's just take a closer look how it all happens in the code, starting from ActivityItem component. So in here, once we select new time by using that select box, we're gonna fire custom event set seconds to complete to the parent component. And as payload for this event, we're also going to send selected time. In the parent component, we will handle this event by using a local function called setSecondsToComplete, which will receive activity object for which we're about to update the time, as well as amount of time that we just selected, which is stored within special event variable. And finally, this event will be handled within the app component by function called setActivitySecondsToComplete. Let's take a look at its implementation. As we can see, there is nothing fancy going on in here. We just take amount of time selected by the select box and assign it to seconds-to-complete property of the activity object. And this is all what is required to set the time for a particular activity. And now to be able to call this function directly from the ActivityItem component, we're gonna use function provide to provide access to this function under setActivitySecondsToComplete key. And now there is no need to listen for setActivitySecondsToComplete on the activities component. So let's remove this registration. And inside of the activities component, we no longer fire event called setActivitySecondsToComplete. So there is no need to use this validation function. We're gonna remove this as well as the handler function setSecondsToComplete, which fires that custom event to parent component. We no longer listen for this event, so there is no need to fire it. As a result, isNumber function is no longer used in this component, so let's remove this import. And of course, inside of ActivityItem component, there is no need to fire setSecondsToComplete event. We will remove this registration from defineEmits macro. And finally, let's also remove the listener, which we're firing this event before. It is this line. And just like before, isNumber function is no longer used. And now in here we're gonna access that setActivitySecondsToComplete function that we have provided access to inside of the root component. So let's assign reference to this function to constant called setActivitySecondsToComplete. Scroll down to the template, and once this event occurs, we're gonna call that function setActivitySecondsToComplete, like so. But this function also requires two arguments. First one will be an activity object for which we're updating the time, and the second argument is actually the new selected time that we are about to assign to this activity object, which we'll of course access by using special event variable. And in those times when we reset value of the select box instead of selecting new time, this event variable will get value null, so we're gonna fall back to 0 in this case, like so. And now as we can see, we are providing one more function called setActivitySecondsToComplete, and we have successfully obtained a reference to this function from within ActivityItem component. So whenever we select new time, we're calling this function directly to assign this new time to a particular activity object. So as we can see, this went well, and the new time was just assigned to the property seconds-to-complete of this activity object. And of course, this value will be updated every time we will select new value. And then inside of ActivityItem component, this property will be used to pre-select the value in this select box. And once we reset the time, that seconds-to-complete property is going to receive 0 value. And that's it for now. Let's keep working on the project in the next lesson. In this lesson, let's recall what happens when we create new activity. So once we type name of the activity and send this form, the new event will be fired from the ActivityForm component to the activities component. And eventually this event will end up in the root component. So root component can add new activity object to activities array. And that activity name that user just entered will be assigned to the name property of activity object. So as it turns out, just to add new object to activities array, we had to fire a bunch of custom events from the deeply nested component all the way up to the root component. And let's try to simplify this process right now by using our familiar technique, provide inject. But before that, let's actually take a closer look at the process of creating new activity. So everything starts from the ActivityForm component. As we can see, here we have a listener for the submit event. And once we submit that form with activity name, we're gonna trigger this function called submit, which as a first instruction in here is going to fire a custom event submit to the parent component. And as a payload, it's gonna send activity object, which represents new activity. And one of the properties of this object stores that value that user just entered in the input field. So then, inside of the activities component, we listen for the submit event and fire another custom event createActivity to the root component. And eventually we're going to handle this event by calling createActivity function defined inside of the root component, which is basically going to push newly created activity object to the activities array. So as always, to avoid registering all those listeners and firing a lot of custom events, we're gonna register this function by using provide function call. So this way, every descendant components will be able to get access to this function by calling inject. So now we can get rid of a bunch of event listeners. Let's start from createActivity event. We're gonna remove this line, and instead we're going to get access to createActivity function from within the ActivityForm component by firstly importing inject function from the Vue package, and then calling this function to obtain the reference to createActivity function and storing it within createActivity constant. And then we're gonna use this function to basically call it once we submit the form to create new activity instead of firing this custom event. And eventually this function is going to just push this new activity object to the activities array, which is declared within the root component. So we don't need to use defineEmits macro anymore because there is no custom events that this component fires. Let's remove this macro, as well as that import of isActivityValid validation function. And now let's go up one more level inside of the activities component. Here we don't need to listen for the submit event. Let's remove this directive, as well as registration of this event within defineEmits macro. And finally, let's go inside of the root component. And once our function createActivity will be called as a first parameter, it's gonna get new activity object. And this is exactly the object that we are creating right here after we have submitted activity creation form. So this createActivity function is gonna push new activity object to activities reactive array, which is basically going to update our UI and add one more list entry to the activities list. So let's try it out. I'm gonna send this activity creation form, and right away I see that the newly created activity appeared on the page and the new activity object was added to activities array. And just because everything happens reactively, the new activity item component was created and added to the DOM. And this way we have simplified activity creation process, and instead of firing a bunch of custom events to the root component, we have provided access to that function which is responsible for creating new activities from the root component to all descendant components. And now if any descendant components will need to create new activity, it can call that function right away, and the new list entry will appear on the activities page. That's it for this lesson. So right now let's see how we can simplify activity deletion process. In order to delete activity, we're clicking on this delete button, and after doing this, custom event gets fired and sent to the parent component the activities, and from the activities component, we're also sending another event to the root component to notify root component that this activity should be actually deleted. And the root component is going to remove one object from the activities array. So right now we're also going to follow the same approach and use function provide to make delete activity function available to descendant components. So this function can be called directly from within ActivityItem component whenever we want to remove particular activity. So let's take a look at the function definition, delete activity, inside of the app component. And this is the function we're about to call whenever we're gonna click on the delete activity button inside of the ActivityItem component. So in here where we listen to click event, we need to trigger that function, so this activity will be removed. But as we can see, for now we are removing activity differently. Firstly, we're firing custom event to the activities component, where we have a listener to listen for the delete event. And once this event occurs, we're gonna fire another custom event, delete activity, to the parent component. And this is where our delete activity function gets called inside of the app component, and activity gets removed. So instead of firing custom events, we're gonna provide access to a delete activity function by using provide function like so. And then we no longer need to listen for some of the events, such as delete activity event on the activities component. So we can open up the activities component and remove defineExpose macro, since we're no longer going to send delete activity event. And up here, as we can see, we also no longer need isActivityValid function. So let's remove this import. And then down here, when we were firing delete activity event, we no longer need to do so. We're gonna remove this listener as well. Therefore, registration for this event can also be removed inside of ActivityItem component, which is this defineExpose macro. And finally, we got to the point where we can call our delete activity function directly once user clicks on this delete activity button. So let's specify a reference to the delete activity function in this listener. And then let's scroll up and also remove import of unused function is undefined. And as it's usually done, to get access to delete activity function, we're gonna call function inject and specify proper key delete activity. And this is the key which was previously used to provide this function from root component. And now let's take one more look at delete activity function. As we can see, it receives one parameter which is activity object. So when we call this function, we need to provide this argument. So let's pass activity object in this function in here. And this activity object is available in this component since this is prop. So it gets passed within this component from outside. And now just to make sure that we haven't broken anything, let's go back to the browser and try to remove activities. And as we can see, activities are properly removed without any errors. And now that activity deletion process is simplified, let's continue our development in the next lesson. In our application up until now, we have 3 pages: timeline, activities, and progress. So we can navigate between these pages by using navigation links at the bottom of the page, as well as there are also a couple of links inside of the header which let us navigate to either the progress page or timeline page. but actually the logic which is responsible for navigating between pages grouped within one place. It is currently located within the root component. So let's switch over to the root component and determine which logic in here is directly related to the routing. So first of all, it is this constant current page, which holds current page name. Another thing is this normalize page hash function, which reads the current page hash and validates it, because later this hash will be used for navigation to a particular page. And then we also have a couple of events related to navigation in our template. First of all, it is this navigate event that we listen to on the header component, because after clicking on the links inside of the header component, we should be redirected to corresponding pages. And also listener for the same event is registered on the now component, because inside of the navigation, we actually have links to all the pages. So basically, to navigate to a different page, we're using goTo function. So this goTo function is also directly related to the routing logic. And now we're going to create separate module where we're going to group all that logic that is related to navigation. So let's go ahead and create new file within the source folder. We're gonna call this file router.js. And now one by one we're gonna move all the functionality related to the routing from the app component into our new router module. So let's start from the current page constant. Let's extract this constant from the app file and move it to router.js. And then let's go ahead and move the rest of functionality. So goTo function should be also moved. Let's cut it from here and paste into router.js. But to simplify things for us, let's rename this function on navigate and export it. As we can see, there is also one ref which is used inside of navigate function called timeline, which is not currently available within this module because it is defined in the root component. As we can see, we're assigning this ref to the timeline component. So let's also move that constant timeline to router.js module, export this from here, and also to make it clear that this constant is going to hold reference to some Vue component, let's rename it on timelineRef. And now let's see what should be imported in this module. Since we're using the function ref, let's import it from the Vue package, as well as normalize page hash function, which should be imported from the functions module. And one more thing that should be imported is the page timeline constant. Let's import it from constants module. As we can see, this constant is used within the navigate function. And now let's not forget and also rename the ref timeline on timelineRef in this navigate function. So now back to the app component. Normalize page hash function is no longer used in here. We can remove this import. And instead what we're gonna do is to actually import all necessary things from the router module. So we need to know the name of the current page in this component, and the name is stored within current page constant. We're also going to need to call navigate function to navigate between pages. Let's import this function as well. And timelineRef, which is used in the template of this component. And since navigate function was previously called goTo, we need to scroll down to the template and rename goTo function on navigate. In this place, as well as in the navigate listener, we're registered on the now component. And since timelineRef was also renamed, let's correct it right here. And by the way, whenever we need to pass to our listener only event object, Vue can do it for us if we can simply specify a reference to the listener function, like so. So we don't need to explicitly pass event object into this function. And after doing all this refactoring, let's actually make sure that we can still navigate between pages by using navigation links, as well as those links located within the header component. As we can see, so far so good, we still can navigate between pages. And also, if we're going to click on the logo, we should be redirected to the timeline page, and at the same time the page should be scrolled to the current timeline item, which is exactly what is happening, so everything is working as expected. And by the way, if I'm going to specify an invalid hash of the page which doesn't exist, then after page refresh, the hash will be automatically changed on the hash of the page timeline. And this is also expected behavior. So we have successfully moved all the logic related to the routing in a separate module called router.js, and this way it will be easier to modify all the logic related to the routing in the future. And the link to the repository of this project will be in the video description. In the previous lesson we have moved all the logic related to the routing into a separate module called router.js, which means all those components that need to use routing logic, for example to redirect to a particular page. They can easily import all necessary parts from the router.js module to do this navigation, instead of firing custom events to let the root component know when it needs to execute certain logic to navigate to a different page. So currently we have a couple of links inside of the header, and when clicking on those links we are redirected to different pages, as well as we have links to all the pages within our navigation component at the bottom of the page. And of course, when we click on the our labels on the timeline page, we are scrolled to a particular TimelineItem components. And additionally, when we click on the logo, we are scrolled to current TimelineItem. So currently all this navigation is happening within the root component. But we can actually simplify this process, so we're not gonna need to listen for navigate event on some components and execute navigation logic within the root component. If we switch over to this component, we can see a couple of event listeners for click events that are responsible to handle cases when we click on the logo, as well as on that link on the right side of the navigation. So we are emitting custom event navigate to let the parent component know when it needs to change page. But actually right now firing this custom event is not necessary, because navigation should happen directly within the header component, because we can easily import that function responsible for navigation inside of router.js module, which is this navigate function. So we can import it directly within the header component, which we're going to do right now. And instead of firing navigate event to the root component, we're gonna call directly function navigate, and this function expects page name, which it should be redirected to. So we're also supplying the page name as a first parameter to this function. We're doing this for the logo component, as well for the header progress, because we have two links inside of the navigation by clicking on which we should be redirected. In the first case, we're gonna be redirected to the timeline page, and in the second case, to the progress page. And now that we have removed the code which fires custom event navigate, there is no need for this defineEmits macro in this component. Let's remove this code. As well as that validation function is page valid. So going back to the app component, and we no longer need to listen for navigate event from the header component. We can also easily remove this directive. And just to make sure everything's working as before, let's go ahead and try clicking on the links in the header. And we see that we are being properly redirected to the progress and timeline pages. So this part is working. And now what about our navigation? We're gonna apply the same technique to call navigate function directly from within the now component to switch between different pages. But besides handling navigate event, as we can see, the now component also accepts one prop which holds name of the current page. And by the way, the name of the current page we can also get from the router module, so there is no need to pass it directly as a prop. So first of all, let's take care about navigate event, and this event gets fired when we click on one of the navigation links, as we can see in here. So let's replace this event with function call to navigate function, like so. And of course, as a first parameter, we need to pass page name we'd like to be navigated to. So now, as in the header component, we also no longer need this defineEmits macro, we can remove this. And to be able to call navigate function from within this component, this function should be imported from the router module. Let's write down an import for navigate function in here. And now back to the current page prop that holds current page name, which is currently passed from the root component. But as was said before, we can get access to the current page variable by explicitly importing it from the router module. So there is no need anymore to accept this prop within the now component. Let's remove this prop declaration, as well as validation function is page valid. And we can see that we reference current page within this template. So let's go up and add an import for this variable. We're also going to import it from the router module, like this. And now that we no longer fire custom navigate event to the root component, as well as we no longer pass current page prop to the nav component, there is no need to have these two directives in here. Let's remove them. Same thing goes with navigate function, because we're no longer calling this function from the app component. The import of this function can also be removed. And if we take a look at the browser and try to click on links within navigation, we can see that we are properly navigated between pages. So our navigation logic works as before. And now if we select the timeline component in Vue DevTools, on the right side we can see that one of the props that this component accepts is current page prop, which holds current page name. And if we take a look at the timeline component implementation, we will see that here we use watchPostEffect function, and inside of the closure to this function, we are referencing that current page prop. And this part of code is responsible for scrolling the page to the current timeline item every time we are redirected to the timeline page. So as we have seen before, current page gets passed within this component as a prop called current page. But we will no longer pass this prop to the timeline component. Let's firstly remove this prop from here inside of the app component. And of course, prop declaration within the timeline component is no longer needed. We will remove this declaration, along with the function isPageValid, which was previously used to validate that current page prop. So now we will not reference any props directly within the script section of this component, so we don't need to assign these props to the props constant. And what we're gonna do instead is we will import current page constant from the router module in here. And in that place where we were referencing current page via props object, we need to change this part and reference current page by using value property, since current page variable is reactive. So let's make sure that after initial page load will be automatically scrolled to current TimelineItem. And as we can see, it is working fine. And now one more little thing that we're gonna do in this lesson is we're gonna go inside of router.js module, and inside of this navigate function, since these two conditional blocks are mutually exclusive, we can combine these two blocks into one by using else if statement like this. And this is it for this lesson. And what we have done is we have actually imported routing logic into those components that need to run the code to navigate to a different page. So now every time we need to navigate to a different page, we no longer need to notify root component by firing custom event so that it needs to do navigation, because now all navigation is fully controlled by the router module. And if any component is gonna need to run the code to navigate to a different page, it can easily import all necessary parts from the router module, such as navigate function responsible for navigation, and then this component can call this function directly to navigate to a different page. The repository link to this project will be, as always, in the video description. In this lesson, we're going to continue refactoring the logic related to the routing. And the first thing what we will do is actually move normalize page hash function into router.js module, because currently this function is defined inside of functions.js module, but in fact, since it is used only within router.js, it might make more sense to move the definition of this function into router.js module. And this way we're going to increase encapsulation of this module. So let's just cut this function from here, move it into router.js, and since this function also uses validation function isPageValid, therefore we have to import this function. So let's go ahead and copy the import of this function from functions.js, move it into router.js, and remove unused import of this function from this import statement, as well as the constant page timeline. And also we no longer have to import normalize page hash function, so we can remove this import as well, because we have moved definition of this function inside router.js module. And before actually proceeding any further, let's make sure that our navigation works. By clicking on navigation links, as we can see, we are navigated to different pages, so we can continue. Now let's open up the header component and do a little refactoring in here. Let's take a look at these two components, the logo and the header progress. As we can see, we have two event listeners registered on these components, and each event listener is responsible for navigating to a different page. But we can actually move registration of these listeners directly within corresponding components. For example, let's cut this click listener from here and put it directly on the link located inside of the logo component right here. This way logic will stay the same anyway. And also we have to copy over into this component function called navigate. So let's copy over this import, move it inside of the logo component, and let's just do the same with another listener registered on the header progress component by cutting this registration and move it directly on the root element of the header progress component, like so. And also the same import of the navigate function we need to add into this component. And now let's go back to the header component, and as we can see here we have two unused constants that can safely be removed. And this way we were able to make this component much cleaner. We don't have any event registrations in here. And we were able to do so by moving individual event listeners of click event into corresponding components and placing those listeners directly on the root elements of these components. So let's just make sure that while clicking on links in the header, we are properly navigated to corresponding pages. And this works as before, as we can see. Next, let's work on the logic, which is responsible for scrolling the page to a particular timeline item when we are clicking on our labels in here. So the logic which is responsible for scrolling to a particular timeline item is located inside of the timeline component, and particularly this is the function scrollToHour. And here we can also apply little refactoring by reducing amount of code in this function. So let's do this. We're going to declare a new constant called el, and depending on the value of the hour variable, when it will be equal to midnight hour. And as we know, midnight hour constant stores value 0. So if this expression will be true, we're going to assign to the constant called el reference to the body element. Otherwise, we're going to use that expression, which lets us get a reference for a particular timeline item DOM element, and use this expression in here. So what we have done in here is we stored value of a particular DOM element that we need to scroll the page to inside of el constant. And now we don't need to write any extra conditions. We can just call method scrollIntoView directly on the DOM element stored inside the el constant, like this. And this way we're getting the same behavior as was previously written above by using that if conditional block. We just need to pass options into this scrollIntoView method. We can just copy this options object and paste it directly as the first parameter to this method. So as we can see, we haven't changed the logic of this function. What we have done is actually simplified it and made it more compact. And of course, now we need to make sure that when clicking on our labels, we're still scrolled to individual timeline items. And as we can see, it is working. And after initial page load, we're also scrolled to the current timeline item. So our previous behavior is working fine. Let's continue development in the next lesson. Let's continue working on the refactoring, and in this lesson we're going to simplify the logic related to the nav component as well as individual NavItem components. These components are responsible for showing the navigation links at the bottom of the page. So let's just see how the nav component is currently used in our code. Let's open up the nav component, and in this component we can see that we render individual nav items by using Vue directive. And actually on every timeline item component we use quite a bit of props. So let's just think about the ways how we can reduce amount of these attributes, because currently it feels a little bit overwhelming. So let's just try to move these three attributes directly into NavItem component. Let's start with href. I'm going to cut this attribute from here and then open up NavItem component and place that href attribute directly on this a tag. And since we're using a special vbind directive with address value on this element, this href attribute was also implicitly assigned to this element before, just like it is now, but now we're assigning this attribute explicitly. And now let's go ahead and move the event registration for the click event. Let's cut this line from here and place it on that a element inside of NavItem component. And this event listener is responsible for navigation to a different page when clicking on NavItem link. And of course, since we use function navigate as an event handler for this event, we need to move the import of this function in NavItem component. But actually here we use a special script with no keyword setup. So to use that import, let's just create another script tag and use setup keyword. And in this script, we can place that import like this. We were actually talking about the difference between scripts with no keyword setup and with keyword setup in one of the previous lessons. So we're not going to stop on this again in this lesson. Alright, let's continue. And if we take a look at the template of this component, here we will see that we are using undefined variable page. So we need to somehow pass this variable from outside, and we do this by using props. We're gonna declare this prop a little bit later, but now let's go back to the now component. Remove the import of unused function navigate, and in this template, let's also cut attribute class. We're also going to use it directly inside NavItem component. So let's apply auto formatting to this file, open up NavItem component, and place that class attribute on this A element, just like we have done with the rest of attributes. And since the expression inside of class attribute uses current page variable, we need to provide access to this variable from NavItem component. So let's just copy over the import of current page, actually cut it from here and move it inside of NavItem component, and place it directly under navigate import like this. And since both of these pieces of data, current page as well as function navigate, are coming from the same module, we can combine these two imports into one, like so. And now it's time to actually pass missing variable page into NavItem component. So let's go ahead and do this. On the NavItem component in here, I'm going to add another property page and pass variable page. This variable stores the name of the particular page. And now we can finally go ahead and declare this property in NavItem component. So let's use defineProps macro and use the following configuration object. The page property will be required, the type will be a string, and as a validation function we're gonna use is pageValid function to check if the actual page name is valid. And since we're gonna reference page prop in the script tag, we need to store all props in a constant. Let's do so right here. And of course we have to import isPageValid validation function from the validators module. So let's see what else can be simplified. And if we take a look at the template, we will see that we are actually assigning the same attribute twice. It is this class attribute. And this part can also be simplified. So instead of assigning two class attributes, we can combine all the classes required by this element in one variable. So we can actually use computed property for this. Let's create new computed property called classes, and then cut all classes from the template and return these classes directly from the computed property closure like this. The same thing we're gonna do with the classes assigned by the second class attribute. We will cut these classes from here and move it into this array that we return from the closure of this computed property. And since we are referencing prop page from the script section, we need to reference the prop by using our props object like this. And this way we were able to make the template of this component much cleaner, and we can only use one attribute and assign classes computed property like this. And one more thing that needs to be fixed in this computed property is a reference to current page variable. Since this is a reactive variable, we need to reference underlined value by using value property. And now let's go ahead and actually write an import statement for function computed. And now we were able to completely move the logic related to these three attributes in this component. So we no longer have to use vbind directive, because previously we were passing all these attributes from outside in this component. So we had to explicitly specify an element where those attributes will be assigned to, and we have done so by using vbind directive. So right now this directive vbind isn't necessary, so it can safely be removed. And by the way, we also no longer have to export this configuration object, which disables standard attribute inheritance. We can completely remove this script. And let's just move attribute class closer to href attribute, so that click event directive will come last. And also previously, when declaring props for this component, I forgot to mention prop name page. So let's fix this right here and finally check the result. And as we can see, navigation links are properly displayed at the bottom of this page as before. And the difference is that now we're actually passing page name as a prop into every NavItem component. And now let's also check if we are still able to navigate between pages by clicking on navigation links. This works as well, and link to the repository of this project will be available in the video description. In this lesson, we're going to continue working on the refactoring of our navigation, and we'll try to change data structure which represents NavItems from objects to array of objects, where every element will represent individual NavItem, which will potentially let us simplify the code in a couple of places. So let's start with the Nav component. And the first thing we're going to do in here is actually move this dynamic component, which is responsible for showing icons for NavItems, into NavItem component. So let's just cut this component from here, open NavItem component, and here where we have used slot element, we're going to replace this slot element on dynamic component. In here we also reference icon variable, which is not available in this component yet. So let's think about the ways how we can get access to this variable. And to actually have a way to access this icon variable inside this NavItem component, instead of passing one prop page name from outside, we can actually pass the whole object that will represent NavItem, and this object will store two fields, page name as well as icon. So let's rename this prop on NavItem, and wherever we are referencing page name, we're gonna reference this property by using NavItem prop like so. And let's just do the same thing in our template. Firstly, inside of href attribute, then in here, when we are passing parameter to navigate function, here where we are showing the page name as a label of NavItem, and finally, when we are referencing icon component. And to actually have a way to pass complete NavItem object as a prop to NavItem component, we need to change data structure stored inside of NavItem's constant, so that on every iteration of this loop, we can obtain a full NavItem object, which later we can use to pass as NavItem prop into NavItem component. And since now all the information about NavItem is stored inside of NavItem object, we need to reference page property by using this object like this. And instead of passing only the page name in NavItem component, we're gonna use NavItem prop and pass the whole NavItem object. And now we're going to work on data structure stored in this NavItem's constant declared inside of constant.js module. So instead of representing this data structure as an object, we're going to use array of objects. So let's declare NavItem's constant in here, and this time we're gonna use array, where every element will be an object with two properties. The first property page will store page name, and the second property icon will store icon component. So for the first object, the page will store the value of the timeline page, which we can grab by using page timeline constant. And as the icon component for the first NavItem, we're gonna use clock icon. And now let's copy this object, paste a few more times, and replace values for page and icon properties. For the second object, the page name will be activities, and icon component is called list bullet icon. And finally, the third NavItem component is going to contain the following values. Page name will be progress, and icon component is called chart bar icon. So we no longer need the previous representation of the NavItem's constant. Let's remove this commented code. And now on every iteration of this loop, we're gonna get individual NavItem object with two properties, name and icon. And then every such object is passed further to an NavItem component. And in here, to validate value of this property, let's just use new function called isNavItemValid. This function doesn't yet exist, so firstly let's just write import of this function by replacing an import of unused function isPageValid. And since we have actually changed data structure which represents our navigation, we have to go to validators module and modify implementation of this page valid function, because as we can see, this function uses NavItems constant. And since now NavItems is an array of objects, we're gonna apply validation a little bit differently. And the way to check if the page name passed as a first parameter to this function will be valid will be as follows. We can call method sum on this array, and in here we're passing the closure, where we are checking if the passed page name equals to the page of some NavItem object from NavItems array. That means that our page is valid, and if at least one closure passed to the sum function will return true the value, the whole sum function is going to eventually return true. And now this is the way we'll be checking validity of the page. Previous implementation can be removed. So one more time, if the page name passed as a first parameter to this function matches any name stored inside of page property of some NavItem object inside NavItems array, that means that passed page name will be considered valid. And now let's create one more validation function, which is going to validate the whole NavItem object. Let's call this function isNavItemValid, which will receive one NavItem we're about to validate. And the way we're going to do this is actually check if our NavItems array includes received NavItem object. So as we can see, the logic here is pretty simple. And please note that here we're actually checking references of objects and not actual values stored inside of properties of these objects. But for our needs it will be enough, because we are actually taking every object from this array and then passing this object as NavItem prop into NavItem component. And that validation function isNavItemValid is basically going to make sure that the passed NavItem object is included inside of NavItem's array. And of course, type of NavItem prop should be an object. And finally, by looking at the page, we can see that the refactoring was successful. Navigation is still properly shown. But the biggest difference now is that NavItem's constant is no longer an object, but instead an array of objects. And it is also important to check that we are not getting any validation warnings when we try to click around and navigate to different pages. As we can see, the console stays clean, which means everything is fine. When working on large applications, there is a chance for different developers use the same keys for providing different kinds of data, and this may potentially lead to all kinds of bugs. So in this lesson we're going to improve the way we are providing data to descendant components. And instead of using string keys, like we are doing in here, we're going to use symbols. So we will create a separate file where we will define all our symbols. And then in the parent component, when we use function provide to provide access to some data, we're going to export particular symbol and use it as a key, as well as where we're injecting the data by using function inject. Here we're also going to export and use that injection key. So let's get going, and the first thing we're gonna do is create new file called keys.js inside the source folder. And in here we're basically going to export all those keys we use for function provide. The first key will be called update timelineItemActivity seconds, and the value of course will be symbol. And since symbols are unique, this way we're going to avoid any potential collisions with injection keys. And now let's go ahead and import this symbol inside of app component. Let's write an import statement. We're gonna group all injection keys inside of keys object, like this. And for the first call of the function provide, let's just reference keys object and use appropriate key that we have just defined inside of keys.js. So now in order to use this key in the component where we're going to inject the data, we also have to write an import statement and import that particular key, update timelineItemActivity seconds, from the keys module. And in here where we use function inject, we need to reference that key instead of this string. But as we can see right now, the problem is that our constant name equals to the key name, which is not going to work, so we have to come up with a unique name of the key. For example, we can append suffix key, and the same thing let's do while importing this key. And of course, where we have defined this constant, we also need to use this suffix key. And one more place where we have to fix the key is inside of app component. Let's append this suffix in here. And now let's make sure that we still can choose the time for a particular activity and then can start tracking this time, and this time will be decreasing on activities page. That's exactly what we're seeing. So this part is working, we can continue. And what I'm basically going to do now is copy all these provide function calls, paste those inside the keys.js, and define constants for every key. I'm basically going to copy and paste individual key names and use those as constant names, like so. And then I'm also going to append suffix key to every constant name. And now let's go back to the root component and pretty much do the same thing in here by appending suffix to these keys and referencing those keys by using object keys. And now what's left to do is actually go into every component where we use function inject to get access to provided data and replace all string keys with symbol keys. Let's start with ActivityItem component. As we can see in here, we're using function inject 3 times. So let's append suffix key to all these keys and then copy these keys and use it for an import statement up here. We're importing all those keys from our new key.js module. Let's just apply basic formatting and switch over to the next component, ActivitySecondsToComplete. In this component, we use function inject only once, so let's append suffix key to this key, scroll up, and add an import statement for timelineItems key, like so. Next one, we have the ActivityForm component. In here, we're using function inject also once, so let's fix this key and write an appropriate import statement for this key right here. Inside the timelineItem component, we use function inject twice, so we have to fix keys in both places, and then copy these names and write an import statement as always from our new module keys. And after this, it is really important to check if our application is working fine. We're gonna basically click around our application and make sure that this way we don't get any errors. As we can see, everything is working good. And now there is also one more thing that I'd like to mention in this lesson. It is related to modifying provided values in descending components. So for example, in this component, we're injecting timelineItems, and let's see what happens if I'm going to try to append new item to this array by using method push. As we can see in the browser, we got a bunch of validation warnings, but in fact, Vue allowed us to modify the data that we have provided from root component, and actually allowing such data mutations inside the descendant components may lead to some bugs. So let's see how we can prevent modifying data from descendant components. And for such cases, Vue provides us with another function called readOnly that we're going to import in here from the Vue package. And now, to use this function, we basically have to wrap the data that we are providing within this function call, like so. And this way, we won't be able to modify this timelineItems array from any descendant component, which is going to inject this data. And if we try to modify this data in the console, we're gonna get the following warnings. So Vue warns us upfront about that we're trying to modify some data in descendant component provided from some ancestor component. So this way, function readOnly lets us add extra security layer and prevent data mutations inside descendant components that is injected in that component from some ancestor component. So let's discard these changes we have done to ActivitySecondsToComplete component, go back to the app component, and in here we're going to make a couple more pieces of data read-only. We don't need to do this for the first 5 provide function calls, since all these calls provide access to functions. But what we will do instead is actually use function read-only for the last 3 calls, since all of these calls provide access to the actual data. And at the end of this lesson, let's just do one more run through our application and make sure that everything is functioning right. So we are not getting any kind of errors, which means our refactoring was successful. It's always important to take a step back and review existing code and see what areas can be improved. So let's see what can be either simplified or changed to improve code readability and potentially maintainability. Let's start with ActivityItem component, and in here where we are listening for select event, we're passing two parameters to setActivitySecondsToComplete listener. And here we also have a check if event variable will be null or undefined, we're gonna fall back to 0. But this is actually an implementation detail, so we can move this detail directly inside the setActivitySecondsToComplete function. And since this function is provided from app component, we have to go in this component, and right here, when assigning seconds to complete to seconds to complete property of ActivityItem component, we're gonna use that operator or, and when seconds to complete parameter will be falsy, we're gonna fall back to 0. So this way we kinda hidden this implementation detail behind this function. So this detail doesn't leak anymore to other components. And now let's see if this refactoring didn't affect our application in a negative way. So let's try to choose time for this activity. And then if we're gonna reset this time now, we are supposed to get value 0 assigned to seconds to complete property of the particular activity object. And that's what we are seeing. So this behavior is working. Let's go to the next refactoring. Inside of base button component, in the template, we have a bunch of CSS classes assigned to the root element. But to make this template cleaner, we can actually move these classes in the script section and assign all of them to a separate constant. Let's call this constant classes. And since we're also referencing prop called type, we have to assign all the props to the constant, like we usually do. And after this, as we can see, we were able to drastically clean up the template. And since by this refactoring we have touched implementation of all buttons, let's just check if all these buttons are displayed properly. So all of them look good. We can go to the next refactoring. Inside the timeline hour component, we have such expression where we're getting current hour from the date object. But just because this expression is used in a couple more places in our application, it makes sense to move this logic in a separate function in order to reduce code duplication. And that's what we're gonna do right now. So we're going to call our new function current hour. At the top of this file, let's write down an import for this function from functions module. And inside functions.js module, we're going to declare this new function with the name current hour and return that expression from this function, like so. So we can now easily reuse this function in different places. For example, inside timeline stopwatch component, we can see that that expression is also used in here. So now we can replace this expression with current hour function call, like so. And of course, this function should be always important in all components where it is used. Let's write down an import statement. The next component where that expression is used is the timeline component. So in here, we're also gonna replace this expression with current hour function call. And at the top of this file, we'll add import statement for this function. Alright, that's about it for this refactoring. Let's go to the next one. Inside the timelineItem component, we have another component called timelineHour component. And this component is responsible for showing our labels. And additionally, by clicking on this component, our page should be scrolled to a particular timeline item. And that's exactly what this click listener is here for. So to scroll the page to a particular timeline item, we are firing custom event scroll to hour to parent component. And as a payload to this event, we are sending exact hour that we should be scrolled to. But actually, it is not necessary to pass this data to parent component because once this event scroll to hour is received by the parent component, we can directly pass an hour of the particular timeline item object simply by accessing our property on timeline item object like this. So there is actually no need to pass extra data along with this event, since all the data we need is available directly in this component. But of course, after doing this change, we have to go back to timelineItem component and change validation function used to validate payload for scroll to our event, because now we are not passing any data with this event. So let's change this validation function on is undefined, which simply validates that this event doesn't have any payload. And at the top of this file, we should also change import of isValid function on is undefined function. And previously I have also made one mistake while importing current hour function inside the timelineHour component. So here we need to tweak this import by adding letter S. The module name is called functions. And now we are ready to check everything in a browser. Let's see if the page is still scrolled to a particular timeline item when we are gonna click on our labels. It is working, and on initial page load, we should be scrolled directly to the current timeline item. This is also working, and the rest of our application is working properly as before. We can continue in the next lesson. Right now in our application we have two main entities, and those are activities and timelineItems. But the thing is that all the code that manages activities as well as timelineItems is located directly inside the root component. So there is no clear separation which code is responsible for managing activities and which code for timelineItems. And now, just to group all the related logic responsible for managing activities resource, we're gonna create separate module which we're gonna call activities, and there we're gonna gather all the logic directly related to managing activities resource. And this way we will be able to drastically clean up our main component. So let's get to it. As we can see, there are a bunch of mentions of activities word in our root component. So let's start creating new module for activities resource. Let's create new file activities.js inside the source folder. And now slowly we're gonna start moving all the logic related to activities from app component to our new module activities.js. Let's start with these two imports, generate activities and generate activity select options. We're going to write an import statement for these two pieces of data inside of our activities.js module. We are importing these things from functions module, and to be more specific, both of these things are actually functions. And let's see what else should be moved. And it's of course this activities constant, which holds our array of activities. And along with that, we're going to also move activity select options array, as well as createActivity, deleteActivity, functions. Let's paste them inside the activities module. And finally, one more function that we also have to move is setActivitySecondsToComplete. Let's cut it from here and also paste inside our new module. And of course, since we're going to need all this data and functions inside our root component, we have to export all these things explicitly. Let's add an export keyword in front of every declaration. And the computed function which was previously used inside the app component is no longer used in here, so we need to also move this import in our new module. And another function which is used in here is ref. And now all we need to do in our root component is to actually import all necessary data from activities module. So let's start. Let's create new import statement. And now we're basically going to import all the data and functions we have just moved to this new module. So now one by one, let's write required import statements for functions setActivitySecondsToComplete, for array activity select options, for a couple more functions such as createActivity and deleteActivity, and finally for activities array. And just like that, we were able to make our root component much smaller. And what's most important is that we were able to group all the logic related to managing one specific resource in a separate module. And potentially we have made our life easier when it comes to supporting this project in the future. And now let's just play around with our project a bit and see if there are any errors occurred after doing all that refactoring by moving a lot of logic related to activities into its own module. As we can see, we're still able to do a lot of things we were doing before, including activity creation. So mostly our refactoring was successful. But actually there are a couple of things which do not work as expected yet, because after we add new activities And then if we take a look at the select box inside the timeline page, we do not actually see that newly created activity sleeping. So this is one problem. Another problem is related to activity deletion. And if now we'll try to delete activity, in the console we see an error saying that timelineItems is not defined. And this error is coming from our new module, activities.js. So let's take a look inside this module. Specifically inside the function responsible for activity deletion, it is deleteActivity function. And inside this function, we are referencing timelineItems array, which is not currently available in this module. And this is why that error is happening. Because as of now, this timelineItems array is declared inside the app component. So we're gonna figure out how to fix this issue in upcoming lessons. In this lesson, we're going to tackle that problem we have faced in the previous lesson related to creating new activities. So for example, if I'm gonna create new activity, I see that new activity object gets added to activities array, but on the timeline page, inside the activity select box, we don't see the new activity. So what's the problem in here? First of all, let's recall where we get data for this select box. So let's open up timelineItem component, and in this component we are using function Inject to get access to activity select options array provided by the root component. And then this array is getting passed as a prop options to base select component, which is going to render options of that select box. And now let's see how we actually provide this data from inside app component. And the first thing that we are noticing in here is that we are providing access not to the activity select options reactive variable, but the actual value that is stored inside this reactive variable, because here we are referencing value property. So that means inside those descendant components where we're gonna access this array will not be reactive. And we actually need this to be reactive because activity select options is actually a computed property defined inside activity.js module. And this activity select options array depends on activities array, and every time activities array receives new activity or some activity is removed from this array, after that activity select options array gets recalculated. But since while providing access to this array we were referencing value property, this means we were actually providing access to the initial version of this activity select options array. So our base select component is not going to receive updated activity select options array after activity creation or deletion. And therefore UI will not be updated and the select box will not show new activity options. That is exactly what is happening right now. So to fix this problem, we actually have to maintain reactivity inside descendant components. So in order to do so, we have to actually provide access to reactive variable itself, but not its underlying value. So we don't need to use here value property. Let's remove this property. And this way we are maintaining reactivity, and whenever one of the descendant components is going to receive access to activity select options array, this variable will store reactive data, and in this case, base select component is going to receive updated activity select options array, and therefore UI will be updated and the new activity option will appear in the list of options. Because here we are maintaining reactivity when we're providing access to activity select options array from the parent component. And now if we're going to check it one more time, after we create new activity we can see that the object was added to activities array just like before, but this time on the timeline page we also see that activity select options array now contains 4 objects where every option corresponds to a particular activity. And therefore that select box now contains options for all activities, including our new activity sleeping. And now we can start tracking time for this activity, setting up the goal on the activities page for this sleeping activity. And pretty much we can do everything with this new activity that we can do with other activities. So whenever we need to maintain reactivity while using provide inject technique, we have to make sure that we are actually providing access to reactive variables, but not underlying values, stored inside those variables. So now I'm gonna do the same for timelineItems variable and provide this reactive variable instead of underlined value, so we can remove value property. And in that place where we are referencing this variable, in one of the descending components, we should reference underlined value by using value property, since timelineItems array is now reactive variable. So after doing these changes, everything is supposed to work as before. We can still set up the time for a particular activity and then start tracking this time, so the time will be decreasing on activities page. And of course we can completely reset this time. Let's continue our development in the next lesson. Just like previously we have done for activities resource, where we have grouped all related logic to activities in its own module, we're gonna do pretty much the same but for another resource, timelineItems. So let's switch over to the editor and create new module inside the source folder. We'll call this module timelineItems. And since the logic related to managing timelineItems resource is located inside the app component, now let's figure out which logic should be moved to timelineItems module. So here we have a declaration of timelineItems array, as well as two functions, setTimelineItemActivity and update timelineItemActivity seconds. And these are three things that we are about to move to timelineItems module, so let's cut all of these from here and paste into timelineItems.js. And since we're gonna need this data in the root component, we also have to export this data, so let's add export keyword in front of each declaration, like this. Now let's see what else should be imported in this module. We're using function ref here, so let's add an import statement for function ref, as well as our custom function generate timelineItems that we are gonna import from functions module, like so. And one more thing that needs to be imported in this module is this activities array. So let's write down import statement for activities from activities module. And now let's switch back to the root component and remove unnecessary imports from here, such as import of ref function, as well as import of generate timelineItems function. And now we are pretty much ready to import all necessary things from timelineItems module. We'll create new import statement and import necessary data that we have just moved in this module. So let's just import all this data one by one. Firstly, it is update timelineItemActivity seconds function. Next one is setTimelineItemActivity function. And finally, we also have to import timelineItems array. And that's about it. We have grouped all the logic related to managing timelineItems resource in a separate module. So let's try it out in the browser. We're gonna assign activity to this timelineItem, start tracking the time. Then let's also try to reset this time and make sure there are no errors. So as we can see, everything is working fine. And just by moving the logic related to timelineItems resource in a separate module, we were able to clean up root component even more, and additionally achieved better separation of concern in our project. Let's keep going in the next lesson. In one of the previous lessons we have faced the bug which is related to deleting activities. And right after we try to delete activity in a console, we're gonna get the following error saying that timelineItems is not defined, and this error is happening inside activities module, specifically inside deleteActivity function. Let's open up this function in our editor. And in here, as we can see, this function consists of two parts. First part is responsible for resetting activity by assigning null values to certain properties of timelineItem object. Because of course, since we are removing the activity, we also have to remove its identifier from all timelineItem objects. And the second part of this function is responsible for the actual deletion of the activity object from our activities array. So it looks like currently this function has two responsibilities. First responsibility is to reset activity identifiers, and the second responsibility is to remove activity object from activities array. So we can split up this function into two separate functions. So let's declare new function inside timelineItems.js module. We're gonna call this function reset timelineItemActivities and paste there the first part of that function. which is actually responsible for resetting activity ID and activity seconds properties of timelineItem objects. And also inside this function we have to know which activity we're currently removing. So let's pass this activity as the first parameter in this function. And after, we could just call our new function inside deleteActivity function as the first statement like this. But since this function is responsible for managing timelineItem objects, and we are currently located inside the activities module, let's not mix in two separate concerns inside activities module. So what we can do instead is we can go inside the app component, and wherever we are providing access to deleteActivity function by using provide function call, we're going to modify this function a little bit. And besides deleting activity, firstly, we're going to reset timelineItem activity IDs by calling our new function resetTimelineItemActivities, like so. And just because these two functions accept activity object, let's pass activity object into both functions. And of course, resetTimelineItemActivities function has to be imported first, so let's scroll up and add import statement in here. And after this, we'll be ready to check result in a browser. So let's try to remove these activities and make sure that our activities array will be empty after this. That's exactly what we're seeing. So our removal activities behavior is working fine. And there is actually one more thing that I would like to change inside timelineItems module, and that is related to generateTimelineItems function. This function is used only here. So it would make more sense to make this function private inside this module. So let's cut declaration of this function from functions module and move it inside timelineItems. We're also going to tweak this function a bit because right now it is no longer necessary to accept first parameter activities, because array of activities is already imported inside this module, so we can simply refer to this array via value property, since this array is reactive, like this. And now we can easily make this function private by removing export keyword. And of course, importing this function from the functions module is no longer necessary. Let's remove this import. So there is still one more thing that we have to do in here, and that is import constant hours in day. Let's scroll up. Actually, firstly, let's go to functions.js module and remove import of this constant from this import statement. And after this, we can go back to timelineItems module and write down import statement for hours in a day constant. So let's verify that everything is still working properly in the browser. Let's try to remove activity. Also, let's try to add new activity and then start tracking time for this activity on timeline page and verify that this time will be decreasing on activities page. So this is working. We will continue our development in the next lesson. In this lesson, we'll continue doing refactoring and try to encapsulate activities module even more. And here I'm talking about a couple of functions that are currently declared outside of activities module, but their main purpose is actually to manage activities resource. So it will be good if we could just move those functions and place them directly inside activities module. And this way, we're gonna increase encapsulation of this module. So let's see what functions can be actually moved from functions.js module to activities module. The first function is called generateActivities. This function is responsible for generating dummy activity objects. And there is one more generator function called generateActivitySelectOptions, and this function generates options for the select box on the timeline page. So let's just go ahead and move both of these functions inside activities module. Let's cut them from here and paste to the end of activities file. Let's see what else has to be tweaked after we have moved this function into this module. Firstly, we have to also import constant seconds in hour. Let's scroll up and add import statement for this constant. Then we no longer have to import these functions from functions module, so we can replace this import with import of function ID, because this function is currently used inside generateActivities function. And now inside of functions.js, we no longer have to import seconds in hour constant. We will remove import of this constant And by the way, right now, since those functions that we have just moved into Activities module, they are not used anywhere but inside Activities module, so we can easily make those functions private by removing export keyword. Let's do it for this function, as well as for the other one. And as always, we have to make sure that we haven't broken anything after doing this refactoring, so let's switch over to the browser and see if generateActivity function works properly, since we are seeing all activities on the page and 3 activities objects are present inside activities array. That means our generateActivities function works fine. And as for the other function which generates options for this select box, as we can see, 3 options are properly displayed, so we can assume this function works as well. Let's make sure that after adding new activity, the new object will be added to activities array, as well as new options object will be created and added to activity select options array. And then on the timeline page, we should see new option inside this select box, as we can see it's here. So everything works well. We can continue in the next lesson. Let's recall how we calculate remaining time for the activity. And for this we're using the function called getTotalActivitySeconds, which is declared inside functions.js module. And then we're calling this function getTotalActivitySeconds inside ActivitySecondsToComplete component. And based on the calculated time difference, this component shows remaining time. But if we actually take a closer look at this function getTotalActivitySeconds, we can notice that this function manipulates timelineItem objects. So it would make sense to move this function to the module timelineItems, because timelineItems module groups all the logic responsible for managing timelineItem objects. And this way we'll be able to simplify this function by actually removing the second parameter timelineItems, because we no longer have to accept it, since timelineItems array is available directly inside timelineItems module. So what we can do instead is basically reference that reactive array via value property like so. And then whenever we call this function getTotalActivitySeconds from component ActivitySecondsToComplete, we don't need to pass timelineItems array anymore as a second parameter. Let's remove this param from here. And now, since this function has been moved to timelineItems module, we need to add an import statement to import getTotalActivitySeconds function from timelineItems module, and we can remove previous import, which was importing this function from the functions module. And as a result, timelineItems array is no longer used in this component, so we don't need to get access to this array by using inject function call. Let's remove this line, as well as import of the function inject. And additionally, timelineItems key is no longer needed as well. We can also remove this import. And after doing all this, there's actually no need to provide access to timelineItems array from the root component to all descending components, because timelineItems array is not used anywhere but timelineItems module. We can remove this provide function call statement. And along with that, timelineItems key declaration can also be removed from the keys module. And in the browser, let's just see if our remaining time will still be properly displayed once we choose the time for the coding activity and then start tracking this time on timeline page. And on the activities page, we're supposed to see that the remaining time will be decreasing every second. So everything is good, let's move on. Now we're gonna go inside app component and take a look at the following thing. Here we're using 2 components. First one is the timeline, which accepts array of timelineItem objects as a prop timelineItems, and another component, the activities, which also accepts one prop array of activities. And since by now we have 2 separate modules, one responsible for managing timelineItems and another one responsible for managing activities objects, we no longer need to pass timelineItems array as well as activities array as props into these components, because what we can do instead is we can actually import those arrays directly inside these components. That's what we're gonna do next. Firstly, let's remove this prop timelineItems and then switch over to the timeline component. Since we have previously removed timelineItems prop, we don't need this prop declaration anymore. Let's remove this whole block, as well as import of validation function validate timelineItems. Actually, we can replace this import with the import of timelineItems array that we are importing from timelineItems module like this. And this way we haven't really changed any logic, but what we have done is we actually changed data source for timelineItems array. If previously we were accepting this array in this component as a prop, now we are importing this array directly from timelineItems module. So in our root component timelineItems array is no longer needed, we can remove this import, and then let's do pretty much the same thing for activities array that is currently getting passed as a prop into the activities component. Firstly, we're going to remove activities prop from here, as well as import of activities array. And then we're gonna go inside the activities component, remove prop declaration of activities prop and validation function, validate activities. Just like for timelineItems, we're going to import array of activities from its corresponding module called activities. And after doing such refactoring, everything is supposed to work the same. So let's switch over to the browser and make sure that everything is working as before. So when selecting the timeline component inside Vue Developer Tools, on the right side we can see that we still have access to timelineItems array, but this time this array is imported directly from timelineItems module instead of accepting this array as a prop from the root component. And if we switch over to Activities page and select the Activities component inside Vue DevTools, here we can also see that we still have access to Activities array, which is imported from Activities module instead of receiving it as a prop. And this is how we were able to simplify our code by using global stores for timelineItems and activities and importing necessary data from these modules directly inside the components that need this data. So let's keep going in the next lesson, and the link to the repository of this project will be in the video description. Currently, to manage our activities as well as our timelineItems, we are providing a bunch of functions from our root component to all descendant components by using technique provide inject. And there are actually a lot of provide function calls in the root component. And if we're going to continue using such techniques, amount of these function calls will grow even more. So instead of providing data to descendant components and then accessing this data by using inject function calls, we can go a different road, and instead of providing data to descendant components, we can leverage our global stores, activities and timelineItems that were created in the previous lessons. And now let's try it out. In the ActivityItem component, we're going to add another import statement to import those functions that are required by this component, such as setActivitySecondsToComplete, as well as deleteActivity. We are importing this function directly from our global module activities, and then we no longer need to use those keys for function inject. So let's just remove these imports. And then there is also no need to call function inject to access those two functions that we have just imported directly from activities module, so we can easily remove these two lines. And now let's figure out where period select options array gets generated, so we could also import this array directly from one of the modules. Currently, this array is generated inside our root component. Here, when using function provide, we're also calling function generate period select options to generate array of period select options. So let's just change the place where we are generating this array by cutting this import of generate period select options function and moving it into constants.js module. And in here, we're gonna use this function to generate that array and assign it directly to a new constant that we're gonna define in here with the name period select options. And as a value, we're gonna call generate period select options function. And this way, we're basically generating this array one time, and then we will be able to reuse this constant anywhere we wish. And by the way, at some point in the past, we have already had such constant defined inside constant.js, but as project evolves, Sometimes we tend to try different approaches which better suit current situation, and in this particular case, I guess defining this array directly inside constants.js module will better fit our current needs. And by doing this, now we can go back to ActivityItem component and no longer use this function inject to get access to period select options. So instead we're going to import this array directly from the module constants.js. This way we don't also need this key we were previously using for function inject. So let's remove this import and instead import period select options array from constants module, and also import of function inject is no longer needed as well. And now we just need to pass this period select options array to the appropriate prop of base select component right here. And as we can see, we were able to completely get rid of function inject in this component. So we're gonna do the same in other components. Let's switch over to the ActivityForm component. In here, we're using function inject only once. So instead of using this function, we're gonna remove it along with imports of function inject and the key createActivity key. And instead, let's just import the function that we need, createActivity, directly from our global store activities, like so. And now we're able to easily call this function directly inside submit function. So we can move on to the next component, timelineItem, which uses function inject twice. So we're gonna do the same thing and replace these two function calls with direct imports of the data we need. The first import will import setTimelineItemActivity function from timelineItems module, and the second import will import ActivitySelect options array from activities module. And of course, this key setTimelineItemActivity key as well as ActivitySelect options key are no longer needed. So we're gonna remove this import. Let's just use a proper import name instead of ActivitySelect options key. We need to use ActivitySelect options. And this way we're able to completely get rid of usage of function inject along with its import. Let's scroll down and get rid of those two mentions of function inject, because the data we were previously accessing by using function inject, we are importing directly. Next up is component timeline stopwatch. In here, let's also replace inject function call by direct import of update timelineItemActivity from timelineItems module, and this way we can remove that call of the function inject as well as its import right here. And now we're almost ready to completely get rid of those provide function calls in our app component. Except of deleteActivity function, we still have to do a couple more things in regards to deleteActivity function. So this function gets called whenever we click on deleteActivity button on activities page. So let's just do this. Let's copy over this declaration, move it inside ActivityItem component. And based on this implementation, we're going to declare new local function called delete and reset activity. This function is going to take one parameter, which is activity we are about to delete. And then basically, instead of calling deleteActivity function when we click on deleteActivity button, we're going to call our new function delete and reset activity, like so. So now the only thing left in this component to do is actually importing resetTimelineItemActivities function from timelineItems module. Let's do it right here. And after doing all this refactoring, we can go back to our main component, and here we can completely get rid of all provide function calls, because all the data that we were previously providing to descendant components we're now importing in all descendant components directly from global stores activities and timelineItems. And additionally, after removing all these function calls in app component, there are a lot of import statements that are no longer used. We can remove those import statements as well. And as we can see, eventually our main component has become really simple. It contains only import statements, and the rest of the logic is spread by different JavaScript modules as well as Vue components. And by the way, that module keys.js that contained all our keys used in provide function calls as well as inject function calls is no longer used because we do not use provide function calls at all. So let's go ahead and completely remove this module keys.js. And now let's just quickly go ahead and run through our application and check if main functionality of our application works as intended. We're going to try to set up the time for particular activity. Then let's create new activity. Let's also try to remove some activity. Then switch over to timeline page and start tracking time for some activity. And let's make sure that on activities page, this time will be decreasing every second. That's what we're seeing. As we can see, this is all working. Now let's also try to remove all activities and see if our empty state is properly displayed. Everything looks good, so we can continue working on our project in the next lesson. There is actually one bug that currently exists in our application, and we're going to try to fix it in this lesson. And the bug is related to timeline stopwatch component. So for example, if we try to select the time for a particular activity, and then go ahead and start tracking time for this activity. And let's say we have tracked 5 seconds for this activity, and for example, we'd like to go ahead and remove this activity after. Then we will see the timeline stopwatch component still shows 5 seconds. But the removed activity was reset. And if after this we're gonna select different activity in here, then the already tracked time should be subtracted from the initial time that we have previously selected for this activity. But as we can see, this time remains unchanged. But we should actually subtract those 5 seconds from this time. So currently our time is out of sync between timeline stopwatch component and between the time stored inside timelineItem object. As we can see in here, local time of timeline stopwatch component shows 5 seconds, and the time stored inside ActivitySeconds property of timelineItem object shows 0 seconds. So in order to fix this issue, we have to know when we're removing activity, and after activity removal, we should always keep this time in sync. So let's try to fix it right now. Let's go ahead and do this. Firstly, let's recall what happens when we are removing activity. Inside ActivityItem component, there is local function delete and resetActivity, which gets called whenever we remove activity. And besides removing activity, we're also calling function resetTimelineItemActivities. Let's see what this function is doing. So it's actually clearing an ID of activity we're about to remove from all timelineItem objects. And besides resetting activity ID, we're also resetting the time. But in fact, if after activity removal, our timeline stopwatch component would have some tracked time, we should not actually reset this time and assign 0 to ActivitySeconds property. So first of all, let's find a way how we can detect if we are removing some activity inside timeline stopwatch component. And to do that, we can leverage function watch. So in here we're gonna call this function, which accepts 2 parameters. Both of these parameters will be closures. In our case, the first closure is going to return that property we're about to watch. And since we need to know where certain activity will be removed, we're gonna be tracking property ActivityID on timelineItem object. And when this property gets reset, in other words, when this property gets assigned value null, we will know that this activity was removed. And when the activity is removed, we're gonna execute the code we're going to specify in the second closure. And in order to keep time in sync, we're gonna call updateTimelineItemActivitySeconds function, which is basically going to keep the time in sync by adding existing time of the timeline stopwatch component to ActivitySeconds property of the timelineItem object. So we need to provide this function with 2 arguments. The first argument will be timelineItem object that we'd like to keep time in sync for. And the other argument will be current time of this stopwatch that is, by the way, stored inside seconds reactive variable. So let's reference this variable in here, specifically value stored in this reactive variable. And by the way, let's only call this function when current stopwatch is running. So we can additionally check when the stopwatch is running by checking the following variable is running. If it's not false, that means our current stopwatch is running, and then we're gonna sync the time by calling updateTimelineItemActivitySeconds function. And actually we're going to change implementation of update timelineItemActivity function a little bit to make it easier to understand. So as you can see, currently this function is gonna add the time passed as a second parameter to the time stored inside ActivitySeconds property of timelineItem object. But what we're gonna do instead is actually accept the time that we will assign directly to ActivitySeconds property as a second argument, without having to add this time. So what I mean by that is, instead of using compound assignment operator in here, we could just use normal assignment like this. And to make it possible, we have to change the way we're calling this function in a couple of places inside timelineStopwatch component. So as a second parameter in here, we're going to pass the following expression. We're basically going to add 1 to existing time stored inside this timelineItem object. So we're referencing ActivitySeconds property and adding 1. And then the resulting time will be just assigned to ActivitySeconds property. And finally, let's do the same thing with the third function call. So here as well, besides actually passing negative value stored inside seconds variable, we're going to subtract this time from ActivitySeconds property of timelineItem object, and then the resulting time will be assigned back to ActivitySeconds property of timelineItem object. So now let's check it out how it looks in the browser. We're going to set the goal for the coding activity and then start tracking time on timeline page for this activity. And once 5 seconds will be tracked, we're gonna stop this stopwatch and take a look at Vue developer tools. So as we can see right now, local state of our stopwatch component, which is 5 seconds, is equal to the value stored inside ActivitySeconds property of timelineItem object. So as we can see, so far our time is in sync. But what if we try and remove coding activity? Let's check those two values again. And this time we can see that the time is out of sync again. ActivitySeconds property was reset, but local time of timelineStopwatch component still shows 5 seconds. And this 5 seconds was not subtracted from remaining time of reading activity. And the reason this is not working as intended yet is because we are trying to keep time in sync only when our stopwatch is in the running state. But we actually have to keep time in sync all the time, no matter whether our stopwatch is currently running or not. So let's remove this condition and check again in the browser. So let's repeat all those steps again by assigning time for this coding activity and then start tracking time for this activity on timeline page. Once stopwatch shows 5 seconds, we'll stop it and then check what time is displayed on activities page. As we can see, the track time was subtracted from the remaining time of the coding activity. So far so good. So let's try to go ahead and remove this coding activity and then on timeline page. Let's check if the time of stopwatch component is still in sync with the time stored inside ActivitySeconds property of timelineItem object. And now everything is good. Time is the same. So we were able to keep the time in sync. By detecting when we are removing activity, we're gonna call update timelineItemActivity function to assign already tracked time of the stopwatch component to ActivitySeconds property of timelineItem object. And this way we're keeping this time in sync. And let's see now what happens if we're gonna choose different activity. We're actually supposed to see that this track time, which is 5 seconds, should be subtracted from the remaining time for the reading activity. And this is exactly what we're seeing. Instead of seeing 10 minutes, we're now seeing 9 minutes, 55 seconds. Same thing goes with another activity training. If we select this activity in here, then on the activities page, remaining time will be affected. 5 seconds will be subtracted from the remaining time of the training activity. And if we're gonna keep tracking this time, we will see that activity seconds time will be always in sync with seconds reactive variable in timelineStopwatch component. So as we can see, that bug was pretty tricky to discover and to fix. But now that it's fixed, we can continue development in the next lesson.